For tens of millions of years, Earth's ancient swamps and forests were ruled by giants with 6 legs and too many eyes. Dragonflies as wide as hawks, millipedes longer than a human body, and armoured bugs crawling through thick, humid air. Then, almost mysteriously, these giants vanished. Was it falling oxygen levels, new predators, changing climates, or something else entirely? Tonight we trace the clues behind one of prehistory's strangest disappearances. If you enjoy calm journeys into deep time, please subscribe and share, and tell us in the comments, what do you think truly ended the age of giant insects? Thank you for watching. Now let's begin. Late in the Paleozoic era, Earth turns slowly on its axis, carrying a face that is both familiar and strange. The planet already has continents, oceans, mountains, and polar caps, but their shapes and positions differ from those of the present day. Over long spans of time, plates move across the mantle and reshape the surface. Several large land masses drift toward each other, gradually assembling into a single growing supercontinent that will later be known as Pangaea. Other blocks of crust remain as smaller continents or island chains scattered across broad tropical and subtropical seas. The timescale of these changes stretches over tens of millions of years. The Carboniferous period begins a little more than 360 million years before the present, and continues for around 60 million years. It is followed by the Permian period, which extends the story of this era for nearly 50 million years more. Across this interval, climates rise and fall, seas advance and retreat, and the outlines of land and water shift step by slow step. In the early and middle parts of the Carboniferous wide regions near the equator lie low and flat close to sea level. Warm conditions and abundant rainfall feed dense belts of vegetation, especially across areas that will one day become parts of Europe, North America and Asia. Rivers meander over broad floodplains, split into many channels, and spread fine sediments into deltas and coastal swamps. Farther from the equator, other climates exist. High latitudes on the southern part of the globe over a large landmass, often called Gondwana, hold continental interiors that cool more easily. Over time, large ice sheets form and melt on these southern lands, linked to long-term cycles in global climate, sea level, and the arrangement of continents. Glacial episodes place thick ice over some regions, while warmer intervals partially remove it. These shifts in ice volume influence ocean circulation patterns and the height of the sea surface. When ice grows, sea level tends to fall and shorelines move outward. When ice melts, sea level rises and shallow seas spread inland again. The Carboniferous climate is not uniform, but many tropical regions remain warm and humid for long spans with frequent rainfall and limited seasonal contrast. Cloud layers and water vapour often cover lowlands, keeping nights mild and days damp. Over swamps and forests, mist gathers above dark water and saturated soils. In the atmosphere, belts of rising air near the equator feed persistent rainfall, while descending air at higher latitudes supports drier zones. These global circulation patterns help set up broad climate bands that wrap around the planet. Within each band, local details depend on altitude distance from the sea and the presence of mountain ranges that can block, enhance, or redirect moisture. At the same time, tectonic forces continue to push crustal blocks together. As the Carboniferous advances, collisions between continental plates build long mountain chains and close ancient ocean basins. The edges of former seas become belts of uplifted rock. Sediments that once rested on the seafloor rise high above the waves. These mountain ranges in turn influence atmospheric flow, guiding winds upward on one side, where air cools and releases moisture, and downward on the other side where the air warms and dries. This produces rainier slopes, and in some regions more arid interior basins. The interplay between low equatorial plains, rising mountains, and high southern lands under ice creates a complex mosaic of climates around the globe. The oceans of this time hold their own structure. Broad, shallow continental shelves surround the main land masses. Here, sunlight can still reach the seafloor, allowing marine plants and algae to thrive while invertebrates occupy the sediments. Beyond the shelves, deeper basins stretch across wide distances connecting different parts of the world ocean. Currents flow through these basins, moving heat from low to high latitudes and carrying dissolved substances including oxygen, nutrients and carbonate ions, which are important for many marine organisms. Over millions of years, volcanic activity continues along plate boundaries and in some regions within plates. Volcanoes release gases, ash and lava, and create new rock. When volcanic ash settles into water or onto land, it becomes part of the sediments that slowly accumulate in layers. These layers, compressed and altered over time, form new sedimentary rocks that record changing conditions at the surface. In the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, gradual but important shifts begin to appear in global patterns. As Pangaea nears its complete assembly, more of the land surface lies in a single large connected mass. Large continental interiors tend to experience stronger seasonal swings in temperature and in many cases lower humidity than coastal regions and island chains. Winds may carry moisture long distances from the oceans, but some interior basins receive less regular rainfall, especially if mountains block moist air masses. This can favour more pronounced dry seasons, or even the development of semi-arid regions in some areas. The distribution of land near the poles and equator plays a key role in the presence and intensity of ice ages. When large land masses sit over polar regions, they allow thick ice sheets to grow more easily, because snow that falls there can persist compact and build up. In contrast, when the poles are mostly ocean ice sheets, face a different balance of melting and accumulation. During parts of the late Paleozoic, the southern supercontinent provides a platform for extensive glaciation, while equatorial belts with their low-lying basins and high humidity remain largely ice-free. Sediments laid down in different settings preserve these contrasts. In polar and high-latitude regions that experience glacial conditions, rocks record scratched surfaces, unsorted debris and other features typical of ice-related deposition. In lower latitudes, sediments show signs of rivers, deltas, shallow seas, and thick accumulations of plant-rich material. These rock records allow later observers to reconstruct the changing geography and climate of the time. Over the span from the early Carboniferous through the Permian, the balance between wet equatorial lowlands, icy southern highlands and increasingly varied interior climates on the growing supercontinent gives the late Paleozoic Earth a layered and dynamic character. On the surface, landscapes respond slowly to these broad patterns. Lowlands flood and dry as sea level, and subsidence change. New mountain belts rise and begin to erode. River systems shift their courses and carve new valleys. Floodplains migrate. Basins that once collected shallow marine sediments may become sites of thick continental deposits. Climatic belts move gradually with shifting continents and global cycles. In this setting of moving plates, changing sea levels, and varied climates, the stage is set for many groups of organisms to expand, diversify and adapt to specific niches on land and in the sea. The physical template of late Paleozoic Earth, with its humid equatorial lowlands, extensive shallow seas, growing mountains and polar ice, provides the broad outer frame within which later biological and environmental stories will unfold. High above the late Paleozoic landscapes, the atmosphere forms an invisible but active layer that links oceans, rocks, plants and animals. Its composition is not fixed. Over millions of years, gases move between air, water and the solid earth, guided by processes such as volcanic activity, rock weathering, plant growth, and the burial and decay of organic matter. During the Carboniferous period, the balance of these processes shifts in a way that leaves a clear imprint on the air. Large areas of low-lying tropical land carry dense forests made of spore-bearing plants, including towering club mosses, horsetails and ferns, as well as early seed plants. Through photosynthesis, these plants take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen, drawing carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in their tissues. In many regions, the soils beneath these forests are waterlogged for long spans of time. Fallen trunks, branches and leaves accumulate in thick mats, and standing water slows decay. In the absence of efficient wood-rotting organisms, much of this plant material resists full breakdown. Instead, layers of partly decomposed organic matter build up. When these layers are buried by new sediments, pressure and heat gradually convert them into coal. This combination of high plant productivity and extensive burial removes carbon from the active surface cycle and locks it away in subsurface deposits. As a result, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere tend to fall, while oxygen levels rise. Estimates based on geochemical indicators suggest that at times, during the late Carboniferous, oxygen may reach values significantly higher than those of the present-day atmosphere. Some reconstructions indicate peak concentrations on the order of around 30 to more than 30% of the air by volume, compared to about 21% in the modern world. Exact numbers and timing remain uncertain, and different models and proxies give somewhat different curves, but the overall pattern of elevated oxygen and reduced carbon dioxide in this interval is widely supported. Elevated oxygen has several physical and ecological consequences. Air with more oxygen supports combustion more readily. In such an atmosphere, lightning strikes in dry periods can ignite vegetation with greater ease, and fires can grow more intense and spread more rapidly even when moisture levels in plant tissues are relatively high. Evidence from ancient charcoal preserved in sediment suggests that wildfires are present in the late Paleozoic, and may be common in some regions, although their exact frequency and distribution are still active topics of research. At the same time, lower carbon dioxide tends to reduce the strength of the greenhouse effect, especially when combined with arrangements of continents and oceans that favour the growth of ice sheets. This helps explain why the late Paleozoic includes intervals of widespread glaciation on the southern supercontinent. Global climate during the Carboniferous and early Permian reflects a balance between warm, humid equatorial belts and cooler high latitudes where ice can persist. The atmosphere carries heat, moisture and fine particles between these zones. Water vapor clouds and aerosols influence how much solar energy reaches the surface and how much long-wave radiation escapes back to space. Over low-latitude coal forest regions, the interplay of high humidity cloud cover and abundant vegetation favours relatively stable mild temperatures and frequent rainfall. In contrast, regions influenced by ice sheets and dry continental interiors experience greater seasonal and daily temperature swings. The atmosphere also interacts continuously with exposed rocks. When rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, it forms a weak acid that reacts with minerals in continental crust. This silicate weathering process consumes carbon dioxide and delivers dissolved ions to rivers and eventually to the ocean, where they can contribute to the formation of carbonate sediments. Over geological timescales, this reaction acts as a long-term thermostat, drawing down carbon dioxide more rapidly when climates are warmer and slowing when climates cool. The burial of organic carbon in coal and other deposits during the Carboniferous enhances this long-term tendency toward lower carbon dioxide and higher oxygen. However, this pattern does not continue unchanged. Near the transition from the Carboniferous to the Permian, additional processes begin to modify the composition of the air. During this time, groups of fungi and bacteria capable of breaking down lignin, a tough component of woody cell walls, become more widespread. As these decomposers act on fallen wood, they release carbon that would otherwise have remained locked in place. More complete decay of plant material returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, instead of allowing as much of it to be buried. At the same time, large-scale changes in climate and sea level alter the extent of the waterlogged lowlands that favour coal formation. In many areas, formerly continuous wet forests fragment into more isolated patches as conditions become drier and more seasonal. These shifts reduce the area where thick peats can accumulate and later turn into coal. Together, more efficient decay and changing landscapes gradually weaken the drawdown of carbon dioxide and the build-up of oxygen. Geochemical records indicate that atmospheric oxygen begins to decline from its Carboniferous highs during the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, while carbon dioxide rises compared with earlier values, though it may still remain below some later peaks in Earth history. As oxygen falls toward levels closer to those of the present day, the tendency toward intense widespread wildfires decreases. Combustion still occurs, but flames may not spread as easily into moist areas, and some intervals may see less frequent large-scale burning. Changes in carbon dioxide and oxygen also shift the balance of radiative forcing. Over time, as the greenhouse effect strengthens some regions that were once cool or warm again, and patterns of rainfall adjust. For air-breathing organisms on land and in shallow water, the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere is a key influence on physiology. When oxygen levels are high, the gradient that drives oxygen from air into internal tissues is steeper, and thin diffusion-based systems can supply gases over greater distances. When oxygen levels fall, the same systems face tighter limits. The details of how these changes affect different groups of organisms depend on body size, body plan, and lifestyle, and remain a subject of ongoing study. What is clear from multiple lines of evidence is that the late Paleozoic atmosphere does not remain static. It moves through a broad arc from relatively high carbon dioxide and moderate oxygen, before the great coal-forming intervals to lower carbon dioxide and elevated oxygen during the peak of coal forest expansion, and then back toward lower oxygen and higher carbon dioxide as decomposition pathways and climates change. Throughout, the air acts as both a recorder and a driver of planetary change. The gases that fill the space above forests, swamps, rivers, and seas carry the combined imprint of volcanic eruptions, weathering reactions, plant growth, microbial activity, and the burial and exposure of organic matter. This shifting mixture shapes climate zones, fire regimes, and the possible ranges of metabolism and body size available to many forms of life that share the late Paleozoic world. Late in the Carboniferous period, wide belts of land near the equator lie low and saturated with water, forming a continuous world of coal forests. These forests stretch across basins that sit only slightly above sea level, where rivers slow and spread, and where tides and storm surges sometimes push seawater inland. The surface is uneven and soft, dotted with shallow pools, channels and peat-filled hollows. Under a heavy, humid atmosphere, plants grow densely enough that in many places their stems and crowns form almost unbroken cover. Sunlight filters through layers of leaves and fronds and reaches the ground as a dim green-tinted light. The air close to the surface is still and moist, carrying the smell of wet organic matter and suspended spores. In these lowland basins, the main builders of the forest are not flowering trees, which do not yet exist, but spore-bearing plants and early seed plants. Giant club mosses stand as tall columnar trunks with narrow crowns at their tops. Their outer surfaces carry patterns of diamond or scale-shaped scars where leaves once attached. Their roots form broad, shallow systems that spread through the uppermost layers of the waterlogged soil, helping to stabilize the soft substrate. Among them, tall horsetail relatives grow as jointed poles with whorls of side branches. Their hollow stems, strengthened with internal supports, rise in dense stands along river margins and in swampy clearings. Large tree ferns and seed ferns add further variety with fronds that can extend many meters, arching out from robust trunks or creeping stems. Together, these plants create a multi-level structure with a high canopy of trunks and crowns, a middle layer of large fronds and stems, and a lower zone of smaller ferns, mosses, and ground cover. Water moves slowly through this environment. Rain falls often, sometimes in heavy downpours that fill pools and channels, sometimes as lighter showers that keep surfaces perpetually damp. Rivers that drain surrounding uplands carry fine sediments which they deposit in shifting bars and levees. During high-flow channels may overtop their banks and spread thin sheets of silt and clay across floodplains. Between these events, standing water in depressions becomes still and often low in oxygen, because the decay of organic matter consumes dissolved gases faster than they can be replenished. In such anoxic or low oxygen waters, many decomposers work slowly or not at all, and fallen plant material accumulates. The forest floor is thick with dead trunks, branches and leaves. Some remain partially upright, propped against neighbours or stuck in soft mud. Others lie flat, soon buried by later growth and flood deposits. Over time, this debris forms mats of peat, a compact mass of compressed plant matter. The depth of peat increases as new generations of plants grow on top of older remains. In many basins, the rate at which plant tissue is buried exceeds the rate at which it decomposes, especially in the most waterlogged zones. This imbalance allows large amounts of organic carbon to be locked away just beneath the surface. Insects, millipedes, arachnids, and other arthropods move through this three-dimensional maze of root stems and fallen wood. Small forms occupy niches in leaf litter under bark like tissues, and in the thin films of water that coat decaying material. Some feed on spores, pollen-like particles, or soft plant tissues. Others scrape films of algae and microbes from submerged surfaces, or take advantage of the remains of other animals. Larger arthropods patrol the forest floor, climb trunks, and rest among branches. Many find shelter in hollow stems in the gaps between roots and beneath layers of partly decomposed peat. Amphibians and early reptiles also share these forests. Some species live close to water using flooded hollows, ponds and slow-moving channels as breeding sites and feeding grounds. Others venture farther from open water, taking advantage of the moist ground and dense cover. Their tracks cross patches of soft mud, and their bones sometimes become part of the accumulating sediments when they die in or near the swamps. The coal forest environment is not uniform even within a single basin. Slight differences in elevation of only a few meters can separate permanently flooded back swamps from better drained levees and channel margins. On the wettest ground, water-tolerant club mosses and horsetail relatives dominate. On slightly higher surfaces, tree ferns and seed ferns may become more abundant. Where rivers cut new channels or abandon old ones, they leave behind crescent-shaped lakes and sand bodies that host changing plant communities as they fill. Over longer timescales, slow subsidence of the basin floor allows the entire package of peat and associated sediments to thicken. New layers of peat form atop older ones, separated in places by sheets of sand or silt from individual flood events. In some regions, tidal influences add another rhythm to this pattern, with repeated cycles of flooding and exposure, leaving thin laminae of mud and plant remains. Each layer records a slightly different balance of water depth, plant growth, and sediment delivery. Above the swamp surface, the humid air often holds frequent haze made of fine water droplets and suspended spores. Many plants release vast quantities of spores into the air as part of their reproductive cycles. These spores drift with the wind and settle on wet surfaces where some germinate and begin new life stages. The abundance of spores and fine organic particles in the air may influence local climate by affecting cloud formation and how sunlight passes through the atmosphere above the forests. Shallow lakes and ponds within the coal forest support additional communities. Algae and simple aquatic plants live near the surface while invertebrates occupy the waters and muds below. Some arthropods and early vertebrates spend part of their life cycles in these aquatic environments, and part on land, linking the two realms through feeding and movement. The edges of these water bodies provide important transitions, where moisture, temperature and shelter vary over short distances, creating many microhabitats. Fire also has a place in these landscapes. During intervals when climate or local conditions produce drier surfaces, litter, and vegetation can become flammable, especially under an atmosphere with elevated oxygen. Lightning strikes, and perhaps in rare cases volcanic activity can ignite fires that move through parts of the forest. In waterlogged zones, flames may pass quickly along the surface or remain limited, while on better drained levees and higher ground they can consume larger amounts of biomass. Charcoal fragments preserved in ancient sediments show that such burn events occur, leaving patches of killed or damaged vegetation and opening parts of the canopy. These gaps allow more light to reach the ground and make space for new growth. Over years to centuries, plants recolonize burned areas and re-establish layered cover, while peat accumulation resumes in wet depressions. At the margins of the coal forests, the vegetation grades into other settings. Toward uplands, the dense swamp plants give way to forests and woodlands on more stable, better drained soils. Here, different seed plant groups become more common, forming communities adapted to less saturated conditions and greater seasonal variation in moisture. Toward the coasts, forests may thin into mangrove-like belts and salt-tolerant vegetation before meeting mudflats, tidal channels, and shallow marine waters. Along these transitions, each step away from the core swamp brings a change in plant types, soil conditions, and the assemblages of animals that use them. Through these linked zones, the coal forest world forms a broad, interconnected system. At its heart lie the dark, wet lowlands that build thick accumulations of plant material destined with burial and time to become coal. Around them extend rivers, lakes, coastal plains, and shallow seas that receive sediments and organic matter washed from the forests. Across this entire region, a persistent exchange of water nutrients and organisms ties the system together and shapes the physical and biological environment of the late Paleozoic tropics. In the late Paleozoic tropics, the coal forests do not stand alone. Around and within them, networks of rivers, lakes, estuaries, and shallow seas shape a broad, watery frame that ties inland basins to the open ocean. Rain that falls on distant uplands gathers into streams which join to form large rivers. These rivers carve valleys, pick up fragments of rock and soil, and carry this load toward lower ground. As they approach the flat equatorial plains, their slopes lessen. Channels begin to wander, splitting into many branches and rejoining again. Where currents slow, the rivers drop part of their sediment-building bars of sand and sheets of silt that change position over years to centuries. At their mouths, where fresh water meets standing marine water, the rivers spread into deltas. A delta is a broad, fan-shaped area of sediment deposition cut by multiple channels. Here, sand and mud pile up into lobes that advance slowly into the sea. Between the channels lie low islands and marshes often covered by vegetation similar to that of the inland swamps. Floods can overtop the banks and move new layers of sediment onto these surfaces, while quieter intervals allow peat-forming plants to grow. The boundary between river water and seawater is not sharp. Tidal currents push marine water landward during rising tides and pull river water seaward during falling tides. In estuaries, which are drowned river valleys influenced by tides, this mixing creates gradients in salinity, the concentration of dissolved salts. Some stretches remain nearly fresh, others become brackish, and still others are fully marine. Plants and animals here occupy zones suited to their tolerance of changing salinity. Rooted vegetation stabilizes mudflats and channel margins, while invertebrates burrow into the soft sediments or live on their surfaces. As the sea deepens away from the mouths of rivers, the influence of terrestrial sediment lessens. On some continental shelves, carbonate-producing organisms become more important. Their shells and skeletons, made mostly of calcium carbonate, accumulate on the seafloor as they die. Over time, this material forms limestone. In other shelf areas, mud and fine sand continue to dominate, especially where large river systems deliver constant loads of debris from the continents. The water over these shelves is shallow enough that light can reach the bottom, allowing marine plants and algae to photosynthesize. Crinoids, brachiopods, bryozoans, mollusks and other invertebrates attach to the substrate, or move slowly across it, filtering particles from the water or grazing on films of organic matter. Fish and early shark lineages swim above them, exploiting the three-dimensional space of the water column. In nearshore, lagoons and protected bays, conditions resemble a hybrid between river-influenced and open marine settings. These semi-enclosed bodies of water often have restricted circulation. They may become warmer, more variable in salinity, and richer in suspended particles than the open shelf. Fine mud settles in quiet corners, while coarser sand accumulates where waves and currents are stronger. Seagrass-like plants and algal mats bind some surfaces. Here too, invertebrates and vertebrates adapt to a patchwork of habitats. Some species tolerate wide swings in salinity and oxygen, using these areas as nursery grounds or feeding sites. Others occupy only the more stable parts of the lagoons and bays. Along the margins of coal forests, small channels and stagnant pools connect periodically to larger rivers and estuaries. When floodwaters rise, they can transport organic debris spores and small aquatic organisms between the swamps and the more open waterways. In return, fish and other mobile animals may enter flooded forest floors, taking advantage of new feeding opportunities. Over longer spans, repeated flooding and drying create layers of sediment that record these exchanges. Thin beds of mud bearing marine fossils alternate with plant-rich layers from terrestrial sources, indicating shifts in the position of coastlines and the reach of tides and storm surges. In some lowland regions, broad embayments cut deeply into the continents. Their shores may host a chain of environments ranging from peat-filled back swamps through freshwater marshes and tidal flats to sandy beaches and offshore bars. Wave action and currents rework sediments along these coasts, sorting grains by size. Storms occasionally build large waves that erode dunes and transport sand inland, while in calmer periods gentler waves rebuild beaches. The shape of the shoreline evolves as sea level fluctuates with glacial cycles and as the land slowly subsides or uplifts under tectonic forces. During times of rising sea level known as transgressions, shallow marine conditions move landward, flooding former coastal plains and swamps. Marine sediments bury peats and soils, preserving them beneath layers of mud and sand. During falling sea level, called regressions, shorelines shift seaward. Rivers extend their courses across newly exposed areas, and coal-forming environments may spread into regions that were previously underwater. These back-and-forth movements can repeat many times over the tens of millions of years of the late Paleozoic, creating stacked sequences of marine coastal and terrestrial deposits. Within rivers and estuaries, water flow is not uniform from surface to bed or from bank to bank. The fastest currents occupy the central parts of channels and the outer bends of meanders. Slower zones occur near the banks and on inner bends. This variation produces a diversity of small-scale habitats. In faster reaches, coarse gravel and sand dominate the bed, favouring animals that can anchor themselves or move quickly between grains. In slower reaches, finer silt and mud settle, supporting different communities of burrowing and surface-feeding organisms. Woody debris that falls into channels creates jams and pools, further increasing habitat diversity. In coastal regions adjoining the coal forests, some water bodies host large predatory fishes that patrol the channels and deeper pools. Among these are xenocanth sharks, such as forms similar to Orthocanthus, which are well adapted to freshwater and brackish environments. Their elongated bodies and fin arrangements allow them to navigate narrow passages and vegetated shallows. Fossil evidence suggests that they can reach several meters in length. Such predators feed on smaller fish amphibians and perhaps large invertebrates that share the swampy margins of rivers and lagoons. Other early shark lineages and bony fishes occupy different niches in the same systems, some specializing in open water pursuit, others in bottom feeding. Their presence adds another layer to the connections between land and sea, because they link energy and nutrients from aquatic food webs back to the terrestrial realm when they die, are eaten by land animals or transport organic matter between habitats. The sediments that gather in these riverine and coastal settings preserve a detailed, if incomplete, record of their dynamics. Cross-bedding ripple marks, mud cracks, and raindrop impressions capture momentary states of flow exposure and rainfall. Fossilized roots, leaf impressions, and coalified wood mark the positions of former land surfaces and plant communities. Shell beds and concentrations of marine fossils mark intervals when seas transgress into the area, or when conditions favor a particular group of organisms. Over large regions, the repetition of similar patterns reflects the repeated advance and retreat of shorelines, and the steady supply of sediment from uplands. When viewed together, the rivers, estuaries, deltas, lagoons, and shallow seas surrounding the coal forests form a continuous system of water and sediment transport. They disperse the products of weathering and plant growth from the interiors of continents to the margins and into the ocean basins. They also create an overlapping set of environments that differ in depth, salinity, energy, and substrate, allowing many different kinds of organisms to find suitable places to live. This watery frame supports and constrains the coal forest worlds of the late Paleozoic, linking them to the broader marine realm and to the global cycles of carbon, nutrients, and sediments that shape planetary conditions over deep time. Within the coal forests, river plains, and coastal lowlands of the late Paleozoic arthropods and early vertebrates form dense overlapping communities. The saturated soils, thick plant cover, and many layers of standing and fallen vegetation create a wide range of microhabitats. Each layer from the canopy to the dark peat holds animals adapted to its light, moisture, and shelter. On the forest floor, in leaf litter and decaying trunks, countless small arthropods move through the spaces between fibers and grains. Primitive insects without wings, early relatives of modern silverfish and bristletails, feed on flakes of dead plant material, fungal growths, and microscopic films. Among them are early winged insects that rest on stems and fronds and take short flights when disturbed. Some have simple, unspecialized mouth parts suited to nibbling soft tissues or scraping surfaces. Others already show more specialized structures for piercing or sucking fluids from plants or smaller animals. These insects form a broad base of consumers that transform plant and microbial matter into animal biomass and provide food for larger predators. Larger arthropods share the same ground. Millipedes and centipedes coil beneath logs and in crevices. Some millipedes feed mainly on decaying plant remains, grinding them in simple jaws and contributing to their breakdown. Others may include small animals in their diet. Centipedes with flattened bodies and long antennae act as active predators, using modified front legs tipped with claws to deliver venom to prey. Their flexible bodies allow them to probe cracks, burrows, and the undersides of bark like tissues. Scorpions and spider relatives patrol both land and the margins of pools. Some scorpions are only a few centimeters long, with proportions similar to modern forms, and feed on insects and other small arthropods. Others reach much greater lengths, their bodies segmented and covered by a protective exoskeleton. Large pincers extend in front of them for grasping, while a curved tail equipped with a stinger arches behind. These large scorpions occupy positions near the top of the invertebrate food web, on land preying on smaller arthropods, mollusks in damp ground or shallow water, and small amphibians or reptiles that move within their reach. Their sensory organs, including median and lateral eyes, and fine hair-like structures on their legs, help them detect movement and changes in light in an environment where visibility is often limited by dense vegetation and low light levels. Early spider-like animals, including groups related to the trigonotarids, share some features with later spiders, but lack silk spinning organs for building webs. They rely on stealth and speed-stalking soft-bodied prey among the litter. Their bodies are divided into a front section bearing legs and a rear section housing the abdomen protected by plates of cuticle. With simple yet effective mouth parts, they grasp and macerate small animals such as worms and tiny arthropods. In doing so, they occupy a niche that in later eras will be filled by true spiders, but here remains part of a wider set of small terrestrial predators. In the shadows below the canopy, insects also take to the air. Early dragonfly relatives and other winged groups such as forms that will later be grouped with paleodictyopterans and closely related orders move between trunks and over pools. Some possess long, slender bodies and 2 or 3 pairs of wings with intricate networks of veins. Their large compound eyes give broad fields of view, important for detecting movement in a cluttered 3-dimensional space. Many of these flying insects feed on other arthropods, intercepting them in mid-air or seizing them from plant surfaces. Others feed on plant fluids, spores and pollen like grains, using elongated mouthparts to tap into nutrient-rich sources produced by seed ferns, club mosses and early conifer relatives. Their flights link different parts of the forest, transferring energy and matter between canopy and understory, between swamp interior and drier margins. Aquatic stages are common in these communities. Many insect lineages of the time, including ancestors of later dragonflies and mayflies, spend their immature phases in water. Their larvae live in ponds, slow channels and quiet backwaters, breathing through gills and feeding on algae detritus or smaller invertebrates. They share these waters with crustaceans and with arthropods such as aquatic or amphibious scorpions and sea scorpion relatives that have invaded fresh and brackish settings. Some eurypterid forms, though often associated with marine or marginal marine environments, enter lagoons, estuaries, or even fluvial systems where they use paddle-like limbs or sweep feeding strategies to gather small invertebrates from soft sediments. Their flattened bodies and spines provide both armour and tools for disturbing the substrate. Early vertebrates interact closely with these arthropod communities. Amphibians of various sizes inhabit the coal forests and their waterways. Some have elongated bodies and many vertebrae with short limbs or no limbs at all, suited to eel-like swimming and sideward undulation on land. Others have more robust limbs and broad, flat skulls well adapted to life on the margins of ponds and streams. Many amphibians feed on invertebrates, snapping up insect worms and small crustaceans. Larger individuals may prey on smaller amphibians or fish. Their presence adds a vertebrate layer to the predatory tiers that already include scorpions, centipedes, and aquatic arthropod hunters. Early reptiles appear in these same landscapes. Unlike many amphibians, which remain tied to water for reproduction, the earliest reptiles possess amniote eggs that can develop on land, giving them greater independence from permanent water bodies. They often occupy slightly drier microhabitats within or near the coal forests, such as levees, drier forest patches and upland fringes. Many are small insectivorous animals that hunt among leaf litter and low vegetation. Their sharp teeth and agile movements make them efficient predators of arthropods. Some lineages begin to explore different diets and behaviours, but at this stage a large portion of reptile diversity is closely associated with feeding on insects and other invertebrates. The interactions between arthropods and early vertebrates are complex and continuous. Insects and other small arthropods serve as prey for amphibians, reptiles and fishes. In turn, amphibians and reptiles sometimes fall prey to larger arthropod predators or to aquatic vertebrates such as xenocanth sharks in nearby channels. Scavengers on land and in the water consume the remains of both groups, ensuring that little organic matter is wasted. The flow of energy from plants to herbivores to predators passes repeatedly through arthropod bodies at different sizes and stages. Within this web size, behavior and habitat use determine the likelihood of encountering predators or prey. In dense litter and peat, small body size and the ability to hide in minute spaces provide advantages. On the forest floor and in open patches, stronger defences such as thick exoskeletons or venomous stings help larger arthropods occupy more exposed roles. In the airspace between trunks and over clearings, flight offers access to new resources, but also exposes insects to aerial hunters. Each zone, from the wettest swamp hollows to the better drained margins and the connected waterways, holds its own community structure, but no zone is isolated. Floods, fires, storms, and the normal movements of animals repeatedly connect them. Spores and seeds carried by wind and water bring plants into new patches. Insects that feed on specific plants follow them, while predators track the distributions of their prey. Over generations, these cycles of movement and interaction shape the diversity and arrangement of both arthropods and vertebrates. In this way, the coal forests and their adjoining aquatic environments function as large integrated ecosystems, where arthropod communities form the main fabric of animal life on land, and where early amphibians and reptiles weave through that fabric as both consumers and prey. The abundance and variety of joint-legged animals, from minute litter dwellers to the largest terrestrial invertebrates of the time, gives these late Paleozoic landscapes a distinctive biological character that is recorded in their fossil assemblages and sedimentary structures. Among the many arthropods that occupy the late Paleozoic landscapes, some stand out by their unusual size. In the humid coal forests and along the margins of rivers and swamps, the largest terrestrial invertebrates yet known in Earth history move slowly across the soft ground or climb among stems and fallen trunks. Their bodies are built on the same basic pattern as smaller relatives with segmented exoskeletons and jointed limbs, but they extend this pattern across much greater lengths and widths. In the leaf litter of the Carboniferous forests, one of the most imposing forms is the giant millipede Arthropleura. Fossil trackways and body remains suggest that the largest individuals reach lengths of around 2.5 meters or more, and widths close to 0.5 meter. Their bodies consist of many similar segments, each bearing a pair of leg pairs, and are covered by strong dorsal plates that meet along a central seam. Seen from above, the animal presents a broad, flattened outline with slightly arched sides and a low profile suited to moving under branches and through dense vegetation. Its legs, arranged in orderly rows, lift and set down in coordinated waves that carry it steadily over the uneven forest floor. The exact diet of Arthropleura remains uncertain because head and mouth parts are poorly known, but the association of its trackways with plant-rich deposits and the nature of its gut contents in rare specimens suggest that it likely feeds mainly on plant material such as leaves, stems and seeds, with possible opportunistic use of decaying animal matter. Whatever the exact mix, its large size and heavy armour make it a dominant presence among the litter, and few predators in these forests can realistically threaten a fully grown individual. Smaller, younger Arthropleura may face more danger, but adults probably move with relative security, their main constraints set by food availability and habitat structure rather than constant predation. Sharing the same broad environments but occupying a different layer of space are giant dragonfly-like insects, often grouped within the order Meganosoptera. One well-known genus, Meganeura, has fossils that indicate a wingspan on the order of 70 centimeters, with some related forms in the Permian reaching even larger sizes. When at rest, these insects fold their long, narrow wings over their bodies or hold them horizontally. In flight, they beat them in coordinated patterns that allow both rapid straight-line movement and agile turns. The head bears large compound eyes that occupy most of its surface, providing a wide field of view and fine sensitivity to motion. The legs positioned beneath the thorax are spiny and arranged so that they can form a basket for capturing prey in the air. These giant aerial hunters patrol above the forest canopy along clearings and over bodies of water. They feed on other insects and small arthropods, including winged forms that rely on spores and plant fluids, and perhaps on small vertebrates in some cases. Their life cycle likely includes an aquatic juvenile phase with larvae, living in freshwater habitats, where they act as active predators on other aquatic organisms before emerging onto land to undergo final transformation into winged adults. In the same era, other large insects develop broad, often patterned wings, and feeding structures adapted for tapping plant fluids. Members of the extinct group, sometimes called paleodictyopterans, show 3 pairs of wings in some reconstructions, with a pair of smaller, sometimes stiffened lobes near the front of the thorax and 2 larger pairs behind. Their wings display dense networks of veins, and impressions in some fossils suggest fine colour patterns or structural designs. Many possess elongated probosces like mouthparts capable of piercing plant tissues and drawing out sap spores or pollen-like material produced by seed ferns, club mosses and early conifers. With wingspans that can exceed 30 or 40 centimetres in some forms, they are among the largest flying insects known. They move between tree crowns and across open spaces, linking specific plant groups through their feeding, and in some cases their role as carriers of reproductive cells or spores. On the ground and in shallow waters, scorpions also reach impressive sizes. The genus Pulmonoscorpius, described from Carboniferous deposits, includes species whose body lengths approach 0.5 metre from head to tail tip. These scorpions have robust pincers strong enough to seize sizable prey, and long tails equipped with venomous stingers. Their exoskeletons show distinct segmentation and often bear ridges or textures that may strengthen the armour. Fossil evidence from both terrestrial and marginal marine sediments indicates that large scorpions occupy a range of habitats, from the damp forest floor to the edges of pools and channels. They likely feed on other arthropods, mollusks, and small vertebrates, ambushing them from cover, or slowly approaching and striking with a combination of pincers and stinger. Their large size positions them as important predators within the invertebrate-dominated food webs. Beyond the forests and freshwater systems in marginal marine and offshore environments, sea scorpions or eurypterids achieve sizes that rival or exceed those of Arthropleura. Genera such as Jacalopterus and Hibbertopterus from the Devonian and later Paleozoic reach lengths of several metres, making them among the largest arthropods known. Their bodies consist of a broad head shield, a segmented trunk, and a tail section that may end in a spine or paddle. Some possess long-spined appendages at the front of the body, suitable for sweep feeding through soft sediments, while others show features more consistent with active predation. Their limbs range from walking legs to paddles for swimming, and their eyes positioned on the head shield give them information about light and movement in the water column. Although many of the largest eurypterids belong to slightly earlier intervals than the peat coal forests, their lineages extend into the late Paleozoic, and their presence shows that arthropod gigantism is not confined to land. In tidal flats, lagoons, and nearshore settings of the Carboniferous substantial eurypterid species inhabit the interface between marine and freshwater realms, sometimes entering rivers and estuaries. Their activities further expand the range of environments where large arthropods play important ecological roles. Not all of the striking arthropods of this time are giants in the absolute sense, but many reach sizes several times larger than most modern equivalents. Armoured worms such as Lepidocoleus, protected by rows of small mineralised plates, move across shallow seafloors and reef surfaces. Although these animals measure only centimetres in length, their heavy armour and specialised defences represent another path by which invertebrates exploit the conditions of the Paleozoic seas. On land, early spider-like forms, while small compared to Arthropleura, or giant scorpions stand out against the background of microscopic life as significant predators. Taken together, the communities of the late Paleozoic feature a wide range of body sizes from minute soil dwellers to arthropods, as long as an adult human is tall. The giants do not exist in isolation but are embedded in complex food webs. Giant millipedes and large plant-feeding insects process substantial quantities of plant material, converting leaves, seeds and spores into animal tissue and waste that enters decomposer pathways. Giant predatory insect scorpions and eurypterids consume other arthropods, and small vertebrates linking lower trophic levels to higher ones. Their sheer size affects how they move through their environments. A large body can cross obstacles that smaller animals must avoid, but may also require more stable surfaces and wider passages. In dense forests, this influences which routes giant invertebrates can take, and where their tracks appear in sediments. In shallow seas and lagoons, the movements of large eurypterids stir up sediments and create traces that record their presence. Fossil trackways, resting impressions, and body fossils from rocks of Carboniferous and Permian age together show that this was a time when arthropods attained sizes unmatched on land before or since. These giants occupy many of the key roles in their ecosystems alongside early amphibians and reptiles and a diversity of fishes, and they help define the distinctive biological character of late Paleozoic landscapes and seascapes. The bodies of the giant insects and other large arthropods of the late Paleozoic follow a shared structural plan. Each has an external skeleton made of a hard material called cuticle. This cuticle is made mainly of the polymer chitin combined with proteins, and in some groups mineral additions. It forms a continuous outer shell that protects soft tissues and provides firm surfaces for muscle attachment. The shell is not a single piece. It is divided into plates joined by flexible membranes. This arrangement allows bending and precise movement at specific points while maintaining overall rigidity and support. Insects show this arrangement clearly. Their bodies divide into three main regions. The head carries mouthparts, eyes, and antennae. The thorax, made of three segments, carries the legs and in winged forms the wings. The abdomen consists of a series of segments that house digestive and reproductive organs and parts of the respiratory system. In giant dragonfly relatives such as Meganeura, and in large paleodic Pteropteran insects, the thorax is especially robust. Plates on the upper side, called tergites, and plates on the underside, called sternites, are thickened and reinforced. This is important because the thorax houses the main flight muscles. These muscles attach to internal ridges and projections of the exoskeleton and act across the wing bases. The wing bases themselves are set into the thoracic wall on specialized sclerates, small hardened plates that can flex and rotate, giving the wings a range of motion. The wings of these large insects are elongated and supported by a network of veins. These veins are tubes of cuticle that contain nerves, air-filled spaces, and sometimes blood-like fluid. They divide and rejoin to form patterns of cells across the wing surface. In Meganisopterans, the veins are relatively strong and spaced to resist bending and twisting during flight. The leading edge of each wing is often thickened, forming a stiff front margin. The trailing edge is more flexible and can deform slightly as air flows over it. This combination allows the wing to generate lift and thrust with each stroke. In paleodic Pteropteran insects, the wings often show even more complex venation, and in some groups an additional small pair of anterior wing lobes. These lobes grow from the prothorax, the first segment of the thorax, while the main wings grow from the second and third segments. The exact function of these small lobes remains a matter of discussion, but anatomically they are integrated into the same general wing-bearing framework. Fine surface textures and possible color patterning suggested by fossil impressions indicate that the wing membranes may carry structural features that influence how they interact with light and with air. On the head, large flying insects carry compound eyes and antennae. Compound eyes consist of many small visual units, each with its own lens. In dragonfly relatives, these eyes take up much of the head surface and wrap around its sides. This arrangement gives a wide field of view and supports detection of movement in many directions. Antennae are jointed sensory appendages that can detect odors, humidity, and mechanical cues. In many large predatory insects, the antennae are relatively short and strong, suited to rapid movements in flight and to fine control rather than to long-range sweeping. The mouth parts of these insects vary with diet. In giant predatory forms similar to Meganosopteron's jaws called mandibles are prominent. They are shaped as strong blades or hooks that can grasp and cut prey. Maxillae and labium, other mouthpart structures, help manipulate food and bring it into the mouth. In plant-feeding Paleodictyopterans, mouthparts often include a long tubular beak capable of piercing plant tissues. This beak is composed of modified mouthparts that form a channel for fluid uptake. In some species, the beak is straight, in others slightly curved, but in all cases it must pass through the exoskeleton at the front of the head and connect to internal muscles and pumping structures. On the thorax, each leg arises from its own segment. The basic insect leg plan includes a short segment at the base, followed by a longer segment called the femur, then a tibia, and a multi-segment foot called the tarsus. In large flying insects, the legs are often slender but strong with spines or setae along their length. In dragonfly relatives, the legs angle forward and can be brought together to form a basket for catching prey in flight. The joints between leg segments are designed to operate within limited ranges constrained by the shapes of the articulating surfaces, which helps maintain stability during rapid movements and landings. In the giant terrestrial arthropod Arthropleura, the body plan extends this segmented structure along its entire length. Each trunk segment carries a dorsal plate composed of two halves that meet along the midline. Beneath these plates are the internal organs and large longitudinal muscles that run the length of the body. Along the sides, the plates curve downward and connect to lateral regions that bear the legs. The legs themselves are relatively short and numerous attached in pairs to each segment. Their structure resembles simple, robust limbs, with a few main joints suited to lifting the body slightly above the ground and pushing it forward. The dorsal plates overlap slightly from front to back, forming a strong armour that still allows some flexibility. Fine ridges and textures on these plates may help strengthen them further and perhaps guide water flow off the body surface. Scorpions such as Pulmonoscorpius present another variation on the arthropod plan. Their bodies divide into a front section called the prosoma and a rear section called the opisthosoma. The prosoma carries the eye's chelicerae, pedipalps, and 4 pairs of walking legs. Chelicerae are small pincer-like mouth parts that help tear food. The pedipalps in large scorpions are transformed into powerful pincers. Their exoskeleton includes strong articulations and thick cuticle that can withstand high forces when grasping struggling prey. Each walking leg consists of a series of segments connected by joints that allow controlled bending and rotation. On the undersides of scorpions, comb-like organs called pectines extend from the ventral plates. These are sensory structures used to detect chemical and mechanical cues from the substrate. The opisthosoma forms the abdomen and tail. It is composed of a broader anterior section and a narrower tail section or metasoma that ends in a sting. Each tail segment consists of a ring of cuticle and internal muscles that permit curling. The sting itself houses a venom gland and a sharp tip. Externally, the tail appears as a series of nested articulating cylinders that can be raised, lowered, and swung sideways. In Eurypterids, the exoskeleton forms a continuous shield over the head and a series of dorsal plates over the trunk. The ventral side carries multiple appendages. The first few pairs near the front are often adapted for feeding, with spines or claws for grasping. Middle pairs may serve as walking legs. The last pair in many swimming forms is enlarged and flattened into paddles. These limbs show joint structures that allow both rowing motions and finer adjustments for steering. The overall body shape of many eurypterids is streamlined with a broad front and tapered rear, helping them move efficiently through water. In both eurypterids and scorpions, as in insects and millipedes, the external skeleton must be periodically replaced for the animals to grow. This process, molting, is a key part of their life history. The cuticle does not stretch beyond a certain point. When growth requires more space, the animal secretes a new soft cuticle beneath the old one. It then splits the old shell along predefined lines, often on the dorsal side or near joints, and wriggles out of it. Once free, the animal pumps fluid into its body to expand the new cuticle to a larger size. Over time, this new outer shell hardens and darkens as crosslinks form in the chitin, and as minerals, if present, are deposited. During the interval immediately after molting, the animal is vulnerable because its exoskeleton is soft. For large arthropods, this interval may be critical, and many likely seek sheltered locations in litter burrows or water until their cuticle stiffens. The distribution of spiracles, the openings of the respiratory system, is also part of the external body plan. In insects, small pores in the exoskeleton on the thorax and abdomen serve as entrances to internal tubes that conduct air. These pores are often bordered by reinforced rings of cuticle, and may have simple valves or lips that can open and close. Their positions, sizes, and numbers vary among groups, and reflect both evolutionary history and functional needs. In millipedes and some other arthropods, equivalent openings lie at different positions, sometimes near the bases of legs. Although the internal details belong to physiology, the visible placement of these structures is a consistent feature of body architecture. Across all these forms, size modifies proportions, but does not change the basic pattern. Large insects, millipedes, scorpions, and eurypterids retain the same segmented exoskeleton, jointed appendages, and regional specializations seen in smaller relatives. What marks the giants is the scale and thickness of their plates, the power and arrangement of their limbs and wings, and the way their bodies occupy and use the three-dimensional spaces of forests, swamps, and shallow seas. Their structural designs set the stage on which internal processes must operate and define the mechanical possibilities and limits of their movements and growth. Inside the bodies of late Paleozoic insects and many other arthropods, respiration follows a pattern different from that of vertebrates. Instead of lungs that move air in and out of a central cavity, and blood vessels that carry oxygen to distant tissues, most insects use a network of air-filled tubes called tracheae. These tubes open directly to the outside through small pores in the exoskeleton known as spiracles. Air enters and leaves through these spiracles and moves along the branching tubes to reach cells throughout the body. The driving forces behind this movement are simple physical gradients, and in some cases small muscular actions that alter body shape or compress sections of the tracheal system. In a typical insect, spiracles lie on the sides of the thorax and abdomen. Each spiracle is a short passage through the cuticle, sometimes equipped with valves or muscles that can open and close the opening. This allows the insect to regulate gas exchange and limit water loss. Just inside the spiracle, the main tracheal trunks begin. These are relatively wide tubes that run longitudinally along the body. From them, narrower branches extend into the thorax, abdomen, head, legs, and wings. The tracheae are lined with cuticle and reinforced by spiral thickenings that prevent collapse. As the tubes divide, they become finer and finer, eventually forming very small branches called tracheoles. The tips of tracheoles come into close contact with individual cells or groups of cells. In some tissues, tracheoles press against cell membranes, and in very active organs they may even indent into the cell surface. Oxygen moves from air in the tracheoles into the cells by diffusion driven by differences in oxygen concentration between the air and the cell interior. Carbon dioxide moves in the opposite direction along similar paths. The efficiency of this system depends strongly on the distance over which diffusion must occur and on the difference in partial pressure of oxygen between the outside air and the internal tissues. In small insects, the distances from spiracles to cells are short, and diffusion alone is sufficient to supply oxygen at rest and during activity. In larger insects, simple diffusion across greater distances would be slow, so additional mechanisms are needed. Some insects use rhythmic expansion and contraction of the abdomen or thorax to push air into and out of parts of the tracheal system. Others maintain strong local concentration gradients by keeping their tissues metabolically active so that oxygen is constantly consumed, and the internal concentration remains lower than that in the air, which promotes continuous diffusion. Tracheae in the wings of flying insects reach into the veins that support the wing membranes. These wing tracheae ensure that the flight muscles which attach to the thorax and must work at high power during flight receive enough oxygen. In the thorax, tracheal trunks and air sacs may surround or penetrate the major muscle masses, providing short diffusion paths from the air-filled spaces to the muscle cells. The structure and arrangement of tracheae and tracheoles in dragonfly relatives and paleodictyopterans are inferred from modern analogues and from rare fossil evidence of internal impressions. In both cases, large flight muscles would require dense tracheation and high oxygen supply, especially in large-bodied forms that spend long periods in active flight. The absence of a circulatory system dedicated to oxygen transport means that these insects rely heavily on the properties of their tracheal system and the composition of the surrounding air. The blood-like fluid of insects called hemolymph plays only a limited role in carrying oxygen, except in a few special cases. It serves mainly to transport nutrients, hormones, immune cells, and waste products. In very small forms, this limitation is not severe, but as body size increases, the distances over which oxygen must diffuse through air spaces and tissues become critical. This is where atmospheric oxygen levels become important. When the fraction of oxygen in the air is high, the gradient between the outside environment and the internal tissues is stronger. Higher gradients support faster diffusion over the same distance or similar diffusion rates over greater distances. In a late Carboniferous atmosphere with elevated oxygen, the same tracheal diameters and branching patterns can supply larger tissue volumes than they can under modern oxygen conditions. Conversely, when atmospheric oxygen levels fall, the capacity of this system to support large body sizes decreases unless the architecture of the tracheal system becomes more elaborate or other adaptations evolve. The tracheal system extends not only along the body axis but also into appendages. In the legs of giant insects, tracheal branches run alongside nerves and muscles. In the antennae, fine tracheoles reach sensory cells that require oxygen to function. In larval stages of insects with aquatic juveniles, such as early dragonfly relatives, tracheae connect to gills or specialized internal surfaces that interface with water rather than air. In these larvae, oxygen diffuses from water into the tracheal system and carbon dioxide diffuses out. The general principle remains the same. A branching network delivers gas exchange surfaces close to metabolically active cells without the need for a closed circulatory loop. Other terrestrial arthropods of the late Paleozoic use related but distinct respiratory structures. Millipedes, including giant forms like Arthroplura, possess spiracles and tracheal systems that open near the bases of their legs on the underside of the body segments. Their tracheae branch through the body to supply muscles and internal organs. The details differ from those of insects, but the reliance on air-filled tubes and diffusion is similar. In such a system, a very wide body presents challenges because tracheae must reach central tissues from lateral openings. The flattened shape of Arthropleura may partly reflect the need to keep diffusion distances manageable, spreading organs out nearer to the body surface rather than stacking them far from spiracles. Scorpions use another type of respiratory organ, the book lung. Book lungs are internal sacs that open to the outside through small slits on the underside of the abdomen. Inside, many thin leaf-like plates of tissue hang in stacks like pages in a book. Air fills the spaces between the plates while hemolymph flows within the plates themselves. Gas exchange occurs across the thin walls separating air and hemolymph. This system gives scorpions and related arachnids a greater separation between external air and internal fluids than in insects, but it still depends on diffusion across short distances and on the oxygen content of the air. The number and size of book lungs and their plates set an upper limit to the amount of oxygen that can pass into the body per unit time. In Eurypterids, respiration likely relies on structures derived from gills adapted for aquatic or marginal environments. Their book gills consist of lamellae or plates arranged under the body through which water flows and exchanges gases with internal fluids. As in other systems, surface area and water flow rates determine gas exchange capacity. When some Eurypterids move into brackish or even freshwater habitats, and possibly spend time in very shallow water or on damp surfaces, their gill structures must still remain moist to function. Across these groups, scaling relationships impose common constraints. As an arthropod grows larger, its volume increases faster than its surface area. For an exoskeleton bearing spiracles, this means that the area available for gas exchange does not keep pace with the volume of tissue that needs oxygen unless the tracheal system changes. It can change by adding more spiracles, by increasing the diameter of tracheal trunks, by elaborating branch networks, and by developing air sacs that allow convective pumping. There are anatomical limits to how far such modifications can go, without compromising other functions such as mechanical strength, water retention, and protection. In a high oxygen atmosphere, these limits are more forgiving because a given spiracle area and tracheal cross-section can deliver more oxygen. High oxygen also allows some insects to rely more on passive diffusion and less on active ventilation. This effect is particularly important for large metabolically active organs like flight muscles. Flying insects must supply these muscles with oxygen fast enough to sustain repeated contractions. In small or moderate-sized insects in modern air, combining dense tracheation with active ventilatory movements is generally adequate. For much larger insects, achieving the same performance would require either very large spiracles and tracheae, which would weaken the exoskeleton and increase water loss, or some other innovation. During the late Carboniferous and early Permian, elevated oxygen likely widens the viable window for large-bodied flying insects because it increases the amount of oxygen that can be delivered through a given tracheal architecture. This does not remove all constraints. Very large wings must still be supported and muscle power must still match body mass and wing area. However, the respiratory side of the problem becomes less limiting. In contrast, when oxygen levels decline toward values close to those of the present, the same tracheal design supports smaller maximum sizes. Observations of modern insects raised in experimental atmospheres with different oxygen content support this relationship. Higher oxygen allows larger body sizes and faster growth in some species, whereas lower oxygen restricts size. Fossil evidence from the Paleozoic and later eras shows that the greatest insect sizes coincide with intervals of high atmospheric oxygen, and that later reductions in oxygen coincide with reductions in the largest attainable sizes, although many other factors also play roles. The internal physiology of giant arthropods is built on these respiratory frameworks. Their hearts and circulatory systems move hemolymph to distribute nutrients and wastes, but do not carry most of their oxygen. Their nervous systems, digestive systems, and reproductive organs all operate within the limits set by how much oxygen can diffuse through tracheae, book lungs, or gills to support their activities. In the late Paleozoic, the combination of efficient diffusion-based systems and elevated oxygen allows arthropods to stretch their body sizes to extremes that are not seen on land in later times. The details of how each group balances tracheal architecture, body shape, activity level, and environmental conditions define the range of sizes and lifestyles that remain stable in their world. The large arthropods of the late Paleozoic live within mechanical limits set by the materials of their bodies and by the physics of movement in air and water. Their exoskeletons, muscles, and appendages must support their own weight, resist external forces, and generate the motions needed for walking, climbing, and flight. As body size increases, these demands change in ways that do not scale linearly. Volume and thus mass tends to increase with the cube of linear dimension, while areas including cross-sections of supporting structures and surfaces such as wings increase with the square. This simple geometric relationship means that as an arthropod grows larger, its mass rises faster than the strength of limbs and cuticle surfaces unless those supporting structures thicken or change in proportion. For terrestrial forms such as Arthropleura and large scorpions, gravity is a central factor. The exoskeleton acts as both armor and structural frame. Plates of cuticle must resist bending and compression from the body's own weight, as well as from external loads. In a small arthropod, relatively thin cuticle is adequate because the forces involved are modest. In a very large one, thicker plates and stronger internal connections between segments become necessary to prevent buckling or cracking. This thickening increases the proportion of body mass occupied by the exoskeleton. At some point, further increases in size would require so much structural material that little mass is left for muscles and internal organs, and movement would become slow or energetically costly. Arthropleura illustrates one way in which large arthropods can manage these constraints. Its body is broad and low with many segments, each bearing paired legs. This shape spreads weight over a large area of ground and distributes it among many limbs. Each leg supports only a small fraction of the total mass, reducing the risk of any single limb failing. The dorsal plates overlap and form a series of arches that can bear load efficiently, while the flattened profile lowers the center of mass, improving stability on uneven, soft substrates. The many points of contact with the ground also help in swampy conditions, where the substrate may deform under concentrated loads. A tall, narrow arthropod of similar length would place much greater stress on fewer limbs and joints. Scorpions of large size use a different approach, but face related issues. Their stance places the body above the ground on 4 pairs of legs. To support increased mass, the cross-sectional area of leg segments must increase, and joint surfaces must enlarge to distribute stress. The exoskeleton of each leg includes thickened regions at points of high bending moment, such as where femur meets tibia and where legs attach to the body. The tail or metasoma, which extends above the body and can be raised and moved, adds another load. Muscles in the trunk and tail base must generate enough torque to lift and position this structure, and vertebrate scale lengths push these muscles and their attachment regions toward their performance limits. The need to retain flexibility for striking while maintaining strength against gravitational and inertial forces constrains how long and heavy the tail can become. Eurypterids benefit from the support of water. In an aquatic environment, buoyancy offsets much of an animal's weight, so the demands on exoskeletal strength for static support are lower than on land. This allows eurypterids to reach lengths greater than those of terrestrial arthropods. However, water also imposes drag on moving bodies. Large eurypterids that advance by rowing with paddle-like limbs or by undulating their bodies must push against considerable resistance. Their shapes with streamlined front sections and tapering tails reduce drag, and their limb joints are arranged to maximize effective thrust across each stroke. Even so, the power output of their muscles must match the demands of moving a large volume through water, and this places its own limit on size. On land and in the air, the dynamics of movement differ. For a flying insect, the main mechanical parameters include body mass wing, area, wing shape, and the force that flight muscles can generate. Wing loading defined conceptually as body weight, divided by wing area influences how easily an insect can generate enough lift to stay aloft. As a body grows larger, without a proportionate increase in relative wing area, wing loading rises, making takeoff and sustained flight more demanding. Large dragonfly relatives such as Meganeura mitigate this by bearing long wings with substantial surface area and by maintaining relatively light bodies. Their exoskeletons are hollow, and their internal tissues occupy only part of the available volume, keeping density low. Nonetheless, their size places them near the upper range of what an insect with direct flight muscles and a tracheal respiratory system can support in air. The mechanics of flapping flight also scale with size. Muscles generate force by contracting, and power output depends on both force and contraction speed. Insects with direct or synchronous flight muscles tend to beat their wings at frequencies that match the natural resonant properties of their thorax and wings. As size increases, resonance frequencies often decrease, leading to slower wing beats. To compensate and still generate sufficient lift, large insects may increase the amplitude of each stroke or adjust wing kinematics to improve aerodynamic efficiency. The cost is that maneuvers such as rapid changes in direction or speed become more difficult. A massive body has greater inertia and resists changes in motion. Turning requires more torque and thus more muscle effort. This tends to produce flight styles that favour gliding straight-line cruising and planned turns rather than abrupt, highly agile movements. Wing structure itself must balance stiffness and flexibility. In Meganisopterans, veins reinforce the wings so they do not collapse under aerodynamic loads, but if they are too rigid, they cannot twist and camber optimally during each stroke. The patterns seen in fossil wings suggest arrangements in which main veins provide longitudinal support, while cross veins and membrane regions permit controlled deformation. At large sizes, forces on the leading edge can be substantial, so thickening of this region is common. Beyond a certain scale, further enlargement of the wings would demand either major changes in venation, which may not be developmentally feasible, or acceptance of increased risk of damage. Takeoff and landing present additional mechanical challenges for large flying insects. From a resting position, muscles must accelerate the body to a speed at which aerodynamic forces can support it. In a small insect, a brief burst of wing beats or a jump can achieve this. In a much larger insect, the energy required is higher, and the time available before obstacles or predators intervene may be limited. Fossil evidence and comparison with modern dragonflies suggest that large Meganisopterans often use elevated perches such as trunks or branches. From these positions, dropping into air and beginning to flap may assist in reaching flight speed. Landings require sufficient control to align the body with a substrate capable of bearing its weight without damage to legs or wings. For giant terrestrial arthropods, locomotion across the forest floor is governed by patterns of leg movement and by the mechanical properties of the substrate. Many legs moving in sequence can provide nearly continuous support, reducing peak loads on any single limb and smoothing the motion of the center of mass. However, coordinating dozens of legs, as in Arthropleura, requires a stable pattern of neural control and muscle activation. Any disruption, such as an obstacle or sudden change in ground firmness, must be accommodated without causing the body to sag or twist excessively. The risk of mechanical failure at joints or along the exoskeleton rises with size because the forces involved are larger and the distances over which torques act are longer. Molting introduces another point of vulnerability. When a large arthropod sheds its exoskeleton, it must free itself from the old shell and expand the new soft cuticle to the correct size. During this process, support from the old exoskeleton is lost before the new one has hardened. Small arthropods can complete molting relatively quickly and can hide in small refuges. Large ones require more time and space. Their weight can deform soft tissues if external support is inadequate. In air, this period is particularly risky because the body can collapse under its own mass. In water, buoyancy helps, but even eurypterids must avoid overturning or crushing delicate structures before the new exoskeleton sets. Thermal conditions interact with these mechanical and physiological limits. Arthropods are ectothermic, relying on external sources to raise their body temperature. Muscle power output is sensitive to temperature, with performance improving up to an optimum and then declining. In warm, humid, late Paleozoic lowlands, ambient temperatures likely sit in ranges that support sustained activity for much of the day and perhaps much of the year. Large-bodied arthropods change temperature more slowly than small ones because their surface area relative to volume is lower. This can be advantageous in maintaining stable muscle performance during short fluctuations in air or water temperature, but can slow their ability to warm up or cool down in response to broader shifts. The need to reach suitable temperatures for walking or flying may influence daily activity patterns, choice of microhabitats and resting sites. The structural design of the exoskeleton also interacts with gas exchange. Increasing the thickness of cuticle and reinforcing plates strengthens the skeleton, but increases the distance between the external environment and internal tissues. Spiracles and tracheae must navigate through or around these structures. If the exoskeleton becomes too thick or too continuous, it can impede the layout of the tracheal system or force longer diffusion paths. Some giant insects appear to solve this by localizing thickening to regions that bear the highest mechanical loads, such as wing bases and limb insertions, while keeping other regions lighter and more permeable. Millipedes and scorpions, which rely less on sustained high-intensity activity such as flapping flight, can afford heavier armor but still must accommodate openings for spiracles or book lungs. In all these solutions, trade-offs are evident. The maximum size attained by late Paleozoic giant arthropods reflects a compromise between the benefits of large body size, such as access to new food sources or reduced predation risk, and the costs imposed by mechanical scaling, exoskeletal design, and diffusion-based respiration. Within the environmental and atmospheric conditions of their time, these compromises fall into ranges that allow dragonfly relatives to reach wingspans of several tens of centimeters, millipedes to reach lengths of a few meters, and scorpions and eurypterids to grow to sizes far beyond most modern counterparts. Their mechanical systems operate near the limits of what chitin-based exoskeletons and tracheal or book lung respiration can sustain on land and in water, defining the functional boundaries of arthropod gigantism in the late Paleozoic world. In the late Carboniferous, the broad belt of equatorial coal forests that has persisted for millions of years begins to change. For a long interval, lowland basins close to the equator remain humid and waterlogged, fed by regular rainfall and high groundwater. Thick peat accumulates in swamps, and dense stands of club moss trees, horsetail relatives and tree ferns cover vast areas with nearly continuous canopy. Around 305 million years before the present, this apparent stability gives way to a more variable pattern. Climate shifts associated with cycles of glaciation on the southern supercontinent alter sea levels and rainfall distributions. When ice sheets grow, sea level falls and shorelines retreat, changing the positions of coastal swamps and deltas. When ice melts, sea level rises again, but the timing and magnitude of these changes vary, and the response of individual basins is complex. In some regions, subsidence continues and swamps can persist, but in others, uplift or reduced water supply begin to dry the surface. The result is a gradual fragmentation of the once continuous coal forest belt. Areas that previously supported permanently wet peat-forming environments contract into narrower zones along stable subsiding troughs or near persistent river channels. Between them, new stretches of land emerge that experience more pronounced dry seasons. Soils in these areas drain more completely between rains, and surface water becomes less reliable. Plants adapted to constant saturation find it harder to establish and maintain dominance. Seed ferns and early gymnosperms, including ancestral conifer-like forms, begin to spread into these somewhat drier sites. Their seeds, protected by coats and supplied with stored reserves, can tolerate temporary droughts better than spores. On better drained ground, vegetation structure shifts from swamp forests with thick peat underfoot to woodlands and scrub with more mineral soils. Within surviving swamp basins, the forests continue, but they are no longer part of an almost unbroken equatorial belt. Instead, they form an archipelago of wet refuges separated by expanses of less humid habitat. The term Carboniferous rainforest collapse is later applied to this broad pattern of contraction and fragmentation. Seen at ground level, the effects are gradual but significant. In some basins, water tables fall, exposing peat and organic-rich soils to more frequent drying. Cracks open in the surface, and fires may penetrate more easily into the upper layers during dry intervals. Rivers incise deeper channels as base levels shift, draining some former back swamps and isolating others on higher ground. Where swamps persist, they may occupy narrower belts along active channels, or subsiding lows, while adjacent levees and floodplains carry more open stands of seed plants and fewer of the towering club moss trunks that once dominated. The vertical structure of the vegetation changes along these gradients. Canopies become patchier, and more light reaches the ground in many places. This allows a different mix of understory plants to flourish, but it also alters humidity and temperature near the surface. In formerly closed forest interiors, air was still and saturated for much of the time. In the more open landscapes that develop, air circulates more freely and can dry surfaces between rains. For arthropod communities, these structural changes reshape habitats. Species that depend on constantly wet leaf litter and peat must track the retreating swamps or adapt to more variable conditions. Populations of giant millipedes such as Arthropods, which favour broad tracts of moist forest floor with abundant plant debris, may become more patchy, restricted to the remaining large swamp basins and their immediate surroundings. The distances between suitable habitats increase, making it more difficult for these large, relatively slow-moving animals to disperse between basins. If local populations decline or disappear, recolonization becomes less likely. Flying insects have greater mobility, but large body size and specific requirements still influence their responses. Giant dragonfly relatives and Paleodictyopteran insects, whose larvae develop in standing or slow-moving freshwater, and whose adults exploit complex forest canopies, may find that suitable combinations of aquatic breeding sites and dense, humid forest become less common. In some regions, lakes and channels persist, but are bordered more by open woodland or scrub than by closed swamp forest. This alters the microclimates experienced by emerging adults, the availability of plant hosts for a sap-feeding species, and the shelter provided against wind and temperature extremes. In forest fragments that remain, edge effects become more pronounced. Boundaries between swamp interior and adjacent drier ground carry different plant assemblages and microclimates than former interiors. Edges tend to be more variable in humidity and temperature, and they may experience higher frequencies of disturbance such as fires and floods. Large arthropods that once used extensive forest interiors as stable low-variation environments must now contend with a higher proportion of edge conditions. Some species may benefit from increased structural diversity, but others, especially those with narrow tolerances or specialized diets, face increased stress. Amphibians are particularly sensitive to the loss and fragmentation of humid habitats and permanent water bodies. Many carboniferous amphibians depend on standing water for reproduction, and on moist surroundings to prevent desiccation. As swamps contract and seasonal drying becomes more common, amphibian diversity in some basins declines. This affects food webs that involve arthropod prey and amphibian predators, shifting the balance of interactions. Early reptiles, with their more resistant eggs and greater independence from water, gain opportunities in the newly expanded drier habitats, but their rise is not instantaneous. It proceeds over many millions of years as lineages adapt to a range of climates and food sources. In the sediments, these environmental changes leave clear signals. Coal seams that previously stack in thick, closely spaced packages begin to thin and become more widely separated. Between them, red or mottled mudstones and sandstones accumulate, representing soils and floodplain deposits formed under more seasonally dry conditions. Fossil plant assemblages shift from dominance by giant lycopsid trees and their associates to mixtures with more seed ferns, chordates, and early conifer-like plants. The geographic distribution of coal-forming basins becomes more restricted, and some regions that once hosted extensive swamps transition to non-coal-bearing successions. Over time, as these patterns continue into the early Permian, the landscapes of former coal forest belts settle into a new balance. In some equatorial basins, swamps persist as long-lived refuges, but on the now more unified supercontinent, large interiors move toward climates that are more strongly seasonal or even semi-arid. River systems adjust to new gradients and rainfall regimes. Some carve into older coal measures, reworking organic rich sediments and redistributing them. Lakes form and drain in response to tectonic movements and climate variations. Insects, millipedes, scorpions, and other arthropods that once occupied widespread, nearly continuous humid forests now find themselves distributed among a patchwork of habitats, each with its own conditions and degrees of connectivity. The collapse and fragmentation of the coal forests therefore mark a major reorganization of the physical backdrop for late Paleozoic life on land. The broad, damp lowland expanses that supported the first great radiation of large terrestrial arthropods become less common, replaced by mosaics of swamps, woodlands, and open areas under more variable climates. Within this restructured setting, the ecological and physiological tolerances of giant insects and other large arthropods are tested, and the range of landscapes in which their extreme sizes remain advantageous becomes narrower. The details of how atmospheric composition and biological processes respond to these shifts, and how those responses feed back onto the fortunes of the giants, unfold alongside this habitat change. As the coal forests fragment and climates become more variable, changes in the invisible world of microbes begin to alter the chemistry of air and soil. During much of the earlier Carboniferous fallen trunks and branches resist complete decay. Their woody tissues contain lignin, a complex polymer that most decomposers cannot yet break down efficiently. In waterlogged swamps, this resistance slows the recycling of carbon. Large amounts of plant material accumulate as peat, and are later buried by sediments locking organic carbon away for long intervals and favouring a rise in atmospheric oxygen. Over time, however, new decomposer groups appear and spread. Fungi capable of degrading lignin, often described as white rot fungi, along with certain bacteria, evolve enzymatic pathways that attack the tough structures of woody cell walls. Where these organisms gain a foothold, dead trees and branches no longer persist as inert frameworks for millions of years. Instead, they are colonized by hyphae and microbial films that gradually break the wood down into simpler compounds. As decomposition becomes more complete and more widespread, the balance of the carbon cycle shifts. A larger fraction of the carbon fixed by plants during growth returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, rather than being buried as peat and transformed into coal. The rate at which oxygen accumulates also slows, because each unit of carbon that is oxidized during decay consumes oxygen. In the late Carboniferous and into the Permian, these microbial innovations combine with the climatic and hydrological changes described earlier. As swamps contract and some basins dry, more often conditions favouring intense peat accumulation become less extensive. More plant material falls on better drained soils where decomposers can operate effectively. Fires may still burn in dry seasons, but the background tendency shifts from long-term storage of organic carbon to a greater emphasis on recycling. Geochemical indicators preserved in rock suggest that atmospheric oxygen, which reached high values during the peak of coal formation, begins to decline. Estimates vary, but many lines of evidence point to a gradual fall from late Carboniferous peaks of more than 30% of the atmosphere by volume toward values closer to those of the present day during the Permian, possibly around 20 to 25% by its middle and later parts. At the same time, carbon dioxide rises from its earlier lows, although it may still remain below levels reached in some later greenhouse intervals. These shifts do not happen suddenly on human timescales. They unfold over tens of millions of years, with fluctuations and regional variations superimposed on the long-term trend. Nonetheless, for organisms whose respiratory systems depend directly on the partial pressure of oxygen in the air, the consequences are significant. Insects and many other terrestrial arthropods rely on diffusion of gases through tracheal tubes and across short distances in internal organs. As outlined earlier, high atmospheric oxygen creates steep gradients that support diffusion over relatively long paths and allow simple tracheal designs to supply large tissues. When atmospheric oxygen declines, the gradient weakens. For the same tracheal architecture, the rate at which oxygen can move into the body and reach internal cells decreases. Small arthropods with short diffusion distances and modest metabolic demands can tolerate such changes more easily. Their tracheal systems and spiracles already provide more capacity than they need under most conditions, and they can adjust behavior such as reducing activity during the warmest or driest parts of the day. Large arthropods with high metabolic needs, especially flying insects with powerful flight muscles, face a narrower margin. Their respiratory systems operate closer to their limits even under favourable conditions. As external oxygen declines, the safety buffer shrinks. At rest, these animals may still maintain adequate gas exchange, but during strenuous activity their tissues may approach hypoxic states more readily. In the late Carboniferous, when oxygen is high, giant dragonfly relatives such as Meganeura likely enjoy wide respiratory margins. Their large wings and heavy thoraxes demand strong muscles, but the elevated oxygen concentration helps ensure that tracheae and tracheoles can deliver enough gas to support hunting flights. Giant millipedes with numerous muscles along their bodies and relatively extensive internal volumes may also benefit from high oxygen, even though their activity levels are lower. As oxygen falls in the later Carboniferous and early Permian, the balance changes. Fossil records show that large flying insects continue into the early Permian with genera, such as Meganeuropsis, achieving wingspans comparable to, or somewhat greater than those of their Carboniferous predecessors. This suggests that oxygen levels, although declining, remain high enough to support giants under certain conditions. However, as the decline continues, the upper envelope of insect sizes begins to contract. Analyses of fossil wingspans across many sites and time intervals indicate that the maximum size attained by flying insects correlates with reconstructed oxygen levels for the first part of their evolutionary history. When oxygen is high, the largest forms are large. When it drops, the largest forms become smaller. This correlation is strongest from the late Carboniferous through much of the Permian, and it weakens later as other factors become more prominent. For terrestrial arthropods that do not fly, such as Arthropleura and large scorpions, changes in oxygen have slightly different effects. Walking and slow crawling require less power per unit time than active flapping flight, and these activities may remain feasible for large bodies even as oxygen falls, especially if overall activity levels are modest and if temperatures stay within favourable ranges. However, these animals still need to support their tissues at all times and to mount responses to stress such as escape from predators or recovery from disturbances. Lower oxygen reduces the maximum intensity of these responses and may narrow the range of habitats in which they can function comfortably. In warm, still air near the ground where oxygen diffusion can be slower and thermal stress higher, large arthropods may become particularly vulnerable. Regional differences in oxygen availability may arise from altitude and climate. Basins at higher elevations experience lower air density and thus lower partial pressures of oxygen for the same atmospheric composition. Giant arthropods in such settings would find gas exchange even more challenging as global oxygen declines. Basins at low elevations, especially those near sea level with high humidity, may offer somewhat more favourable conditions. As habitats shift and basins rise or fall through tectonic processes, the local viability of giant forms changes accordingly. The decline in oxygen also interacts with fire regimes. High oxygen supports frequent intense fires that can reshape vegetation and soil. As oxygen falls, the range of moisture conditions that permit ignition narrows, and fires may become less widespread or less severe, especially in humid regions. For arthropods and other animals, this can reduce direct mortality from burns, but it also affects the structure of plant communities and the distribution of open and closed habitats. The overall cooling influence of lower carbon dioxide in the earlier Carboniferous is partly offset by rising carbon dioxide in the Permian. This modifies temperature and precipitation patterns, further complicating the picture. In many terrestrial ecosystems, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse and its aftermath produce a more heterogeneous set of landscapes. Some habitats remain wet and cool enough that declines in oxygen are less critical for large arthropods, while others, now drier and more seasonal, amplify the stresses of reduced oxygen. Within these mosaics, populations respond in different ways. Some lineages shrink in body size over time with descendants that are smaller, but otherwise similar in form to their ancestors. This pattern is seen in some insect groups where early representatives reach large sizes, and later ones in the same or related lineages are smaller, under changed atmospheric conditions. Smaller body size reduces diffusion distance and lowers absolute metabolic demands, easing the respiratory challenge. Other lineages disappear entirely. Arthropleura, for example, does not persist beyond the early Permian. Large scorpion species known from the Carboniferous have no direct equivalents in later terrestrial faunas, although scorpions as a group continue with smaller body sizes and modified habits. Among Paleodic Teopteran insects, some of the largest sap-feeding forms decline and eventually vanish through the Permian in association with both oxygen changes and shifts in plant communities. The reduction in maximum body size alters ecosystem structure. Where once a few very large arthropods processed much of the coarse plant debris or acted as top invertebrate predators, their roles shift to multiple smaller species. Nutrient and energy pathways through food webs may become more diffuse with no single species dominating. For vertebrates, the narrowing of arthropod giants means that large amphibians and early reptiles, and in some settings, early synapsids, can occupy more of the large-bodied herbivore and predator niches. These changes set the stage for later faunal compositions, but at this stage the main pattern is a slow rebalancing of body size distributions among arthropods and their interactions with vertebrates. Uncertainties remain in the details of timing and causation. Oxygen reconstructions rely on proxies that have limits in precision and resolution. The exact sequence of microbial innovations, plant community changes, and atmospheric responses is complex and may vary between regions. However, the broad link between reduced burial of organic carbon, increased decomposition, declining oxygen, and the contraction of arthropod gigantism is supported by multiple independent lines of evidence. In the late Paleozoic, the giants lived through a long interval in which their world slowly becomes less favourable to very large bodies. Habitat fragmentation, shifting climates and evolving decomposer communities all contribute to a steady tightening of the physiological constraints that once allowed arthropods to reach exceptional sizes. As the late Carboniferous gives way to the Permian, changes in the land plants of the continents become increasingly important for the arthropods that depend on them. The coal forests that once stretch in broad belts around the equator are now broken into scattered wet basins and valley systems. On the higher and drier ground between these refuges, new plant communities build their own persistent cover. Seed ferns, chordates, and early conifer relatives expand in many regions, forming woodlands and open forests on better drained soils. These plants differ from the giant club mosses and horsetail trees of the older swamps, not only in outward shape but also in growth patterns, tissues, and chemistry. Their roots penetrate deeper. Their stems and leaves are built with different proportions of cellulose, lignin, and defensive compounds, and their reproductive organs produce seeds and pollen instead of spores released directly into the air in vast quantities. For insects and other arthropods, these shifts mean that the texture and nutritional quality of available plant food changes over time. In the earlier coal forest phase, many plant feeders exploit soft tissues of leucopsids, ferns, and simple seed plants, as well as spores and pollen-like particles that are produced in abundance and dispersed widely. Sap feeders tap the conductive tissues that carry water and dissolve nutrients through stems and leaves. Chewers remove pieces of fronds and young shoots. Detritivores process fallen leaves and fragments that accumulate on the forest floor and in shallow water. Giant paleodictyopteran insects with their broad wings and long piercing mouthparts are part of this world. Their beaks allow them to reach into tissues of ferns, seed ferns, and other early plants, drawing out fluids and utilizing the chemical energy captured by photosynthesis. The large size of some paleodictyopterans suggests that suitable food is abundant and that the plants they exploit provide enough energy to support sizable bodies and active flight. In the Permian, as climates become more seasonal and some regions trend toward greater aridity, the structure of vegetation shifts. Conifer-like plants and other drought-tolerant gymnosperms become more common on uplands and in continental interiors. Their leaves are often narrow, tough, and defended by thick cuticle and resin canals. Their wood differs in arrangement and composition from that of earlier coal forest trees. At the same time, atmospheric carbon dioxide rises compared with late Carboniferous lows. Experimental work on modern plants and theoretical considerations suggest that under higher carbon dioxide, some plants may invest differently in carbon-rich structural tissues and may show lower concentrations of certain nutrients per unit mass of leaf or stem. For ancient floras, direct measurements are not possible, but fossil evidence and models indicate that the nutritional value and defensive chemistry of late Paleozoic plants shift in ways that affect herbivores. Plant groups differ in how they respond. Some maintain relatively nutritious soft leaves, while others develop tougher tissues and more complex defenses. Insects whose mouthparts and digestive systems are specialized for particular plant types face new challenges when their preferred hosts decline. Paleodictyopteran insects illustrate the tight link between plant communities and insect diets. Many members of this group appear to be tied to swamp floras dominated by seed ferns, lycopsids, and other early lineages. Their mouthpart structure is well suited to piercing these plants and withdrawing sap spores and other fluids. As coal forests contract and are replaced over wide areas by woodlands of conifer-like plants and drier scrub, the abundance of their favoured hosts falls. In some regions, remaining swamp refuges still support Paleodictyopterans, and their fossils continue into the late Permian, but their geographic range and diversity shrink. Where local plant communities change more completely, Paleodictyopterans vanish from the record. Other insect groups with different feeding strategies adapt more readily to the new floras. Some chewing insects evolve stronger mandibles and digestive capabilities that allow them to process tougher leaves and seeds from gymnosperms. Others develop more specialized piercing and sucking mouthparts tailored to the vascular tissues of conifers and related plants. New lineages of sap feeders and seed predators appear or diversify in the Permian, taking advantage of the reproductive structures and nutrient flows of the emerging plant groups. The transition is not instantaneous. For millions of years, mixed floras with elements of both older swamp plants and newer dry land plants coexist in many regions. In these mosaics, insect faunas also show mixtures. Giant sap-feeding insects continue where their hosts persist, while smaller, more versatile forms expand into the surrounding uplands and semi-arid plains. Over time, however, the balance tilts. By the late Permian in many continental interiors, drier, more open vegetations dominated by gymnosperms and drought-tolerant seed plants occupy large areas, while classic cold swamp floras are restricted to comparatively few basins. The nutritional landscape for herbivorous insects now differs markedly from that of the Carboniferous. In some hypotheses, elevated carbon dioxide reduces the relative protein and mineral content of plant tissues, forcing herbivores to consume more material to obtain the same nutrients. Tougher tissues and resins also make feeding more difficult and may deter or harm generalist herbivores. Under such conditions, smaller body size can be advantageous. Small insects require less absolute food, can complete life cycles quickly, and can exploit fine-scale patches of suitable tissues on individual plants. Large insects with fixed, highly specialized feeding apparatus, such as many Paleodictyopterans, may find that the combination of scarcer hosts' lower nutritional value and increased plant defenses pushes their physiological and ecological systems toward their limits. In aquatic and detrital pathways, plant changes also matter. Leaves and wood that fall into streams, lakes, and shallow seas now come from a different mix of species. Their breakdown rates and the communities of fungi and microbes that colonize them influence the resources available to aquatic insect larvae and other detritivores. Some lineages adjust by shifting diet or microhabitat, others decline. For giant aquatic or semi-aquatic arthropods such as large eurypterids that persist into parts of the Permian, the overall productivity of their habitats and the structure of food webs feeding into them affect how much prey is available. As plant-driven primary production patterns alter in both freshwater and marginal marine systems, the supporting base of these food webs changes its character. The contraction of certain plant hosts not only reduces food, but also removes structural habitats. Many insects use specific plant architectures for egg-laying shelter or mating displays. When those plants disappear from large regions, insects that depend on them must either adapt to new hosts or vanish. The disappearance of Paleodictyopterans by the end of the Permian is often linked to this deep reliance on particular floras. Their distinctive 3 pairs of wings and piercing beaks successful in the Carboniferous world of fern and seed, fern forests become less suited to the dominant Permian landscapes. Meanwhile, lineages that can utilize conifer cones, seeds, and tough leaves become more prominent in the faunas of many regions. From the perspective of body size, these plant and diet shifts tend to favor smaller and more specialized forms over very large generalists tied to a narrow set of hosts. In the Carboniferous, high oxygen and abundant relatively nutritious swamp plants allow some insect groups to achieve large sizes while feeding on widespread resources. In the Permian, declining oxygen, fragmented wetlands, and a move toward drier, chemically defended vegetation narrow this opportunity. Phylogenetic studies and fossil assemblages together suggest that many of the largest plant-feeding insect lineages show long-term declines in diversity and size through the Permian, while smaller forms with more flexible diets persist or expand. Predatory arthropods respond indirectly to these changes as their prey base reorganizes. Large predators that formerly focused on big sap feeders and bulky herbivores encounter fewer such targets. They may switch to smaller prey or face declining numbers. In some areas, early vertebrate predators increasingly share or take over roles once held by giant arthropods. At this stage, the interplay between plants and insects becomes a central driver, of which lineages can maintain large body sizes. Physiological limits set by respiration and mechanics remain important, but the external supply of food and the structure of habitats define whether a giant can find enough to eat and enough suitable space to complete its life cycle. In the late Paleozoic, the shift from coal forest floras to more drought-tolerant gymnosperm-dominated landscapes progressively removes many of the ecological supports that once favoured giant sap-feeding insects and large detritivores, leaving a biota increasingly shaped by smaller, more specialised arthropods adapted to the new plant world. Long after the coal forests have fragmented and many of the great late Paleozoic arthropods have disappeared, insects continue to evolve through the Triassic and Jurassic periods. The continents have rearranged, climates have shifted, and plant communities now include forests of conifers and other gymnosperms along with ferns and seed ferns in many regions. Atmospheric oxygen, after the highs of the late Carboniferous, has declined toward values closer to those of the present day. Through this time, insects diversify into many new forms, but their largest representatives, while still sizable by modern standards, do not reach the extreme dimensions of the Carboniferous giants. In the skies above Jurassic forests and coastal plains, another important change takes place. Vertebrate flight evolves in several lineages. Pterosaurs, the first known vertebrate flyers, appear in the late Triassic and develop into a wide range of shapes and sizes, some of them specialised for catching small animals in the air or over water. Later in the late Jurassic, early birds arise from small feathered theropod dinosaurs. One well-known genus, Archaeopteryx, shows a mix of features feathers on its wings and tail teeth in its jaws, clawed fingers on its wings, and a long bony tail. Its body length is on the order of 1/2 metre, comparable to a crow or magpie, and it is capable of powered flight, or at least extended gliding. Its descendants and relatives, along with other early birds, gradually refine flight over millions of years, shortening the tail, changing the shoulder and chest structure, and developing more efficient wings and muscles. These early birds share the air with insects that have already been through many episodes of environmental change. In the late Paleozoic, large flying insects such as meganosopterans and paleodictyopterans occupy the role of major aerial hunters and sap feeders. By the Jurassic, those orders are gone, replaced by descendants of other lineages, including early relatives of modern dragonflies, mayflies, grasshoppers, true bugs and beetles. Some of these insects still achieve large wingspans, especially in groups that glide or make long, steady flights over open areas. Their body sizes remain substantial in absolute terms, but they now share the sky with vertebrate flyers that hunt actively and can pursue prey with different strategies. Bird flight operates on a different mechanical and sensory basis from insect flight. Wings made of feathers attached to bone a skeleton with hollow bones, and a keeled sternum for muscle attachment, and a lung system with air sacs that provides continuous flow through the respiratory surfaces, allow birds to support relatively high metabolic rates and sustained flapping flight. Their large eyes, flexible necks, and complex brains support sophisticated visual processing and manoeuvring. Even early birds whose flight is less refined than that of many modern species can combine flapping with gliding adjust wing shape, and use tail feathers for steering. In a world where such predators exist, the risks faced by flying insects change. Large insects with broad wings and relatively slow turning speeds present easier targets than small compact forms that can jink and dive rapidly. In open airspace over forest edges, lakes or coastal zones, a bird can detect an insect at a distance, close the gap by flapping or gliding and strike with its beak. For the insect, avoiding capture may require abrupt changes in direction, rapid acceleration, or use of cluttered airspaces near vegetation where a pursuer cannot easily follow. Smaller size, shorter wings, and higher relative wing beat frequencies favour such manoeuvres. Larger insects with higher wing loading and greater inertia find it harder to change course quickly. Over evolutionary time, natural selection acts on these interactions. Insect lineages that tend to be large, slow-turning, and reliant on broad, open flight paths incur higher predation rates and contribute less to future generations. Those that are smaller, more agile, or that shift their activity to times or places where birds are less effective may fare better. The result is a bias against very large flying forms in habitats where birds and other aerial vertebrate predators are common and active. Studies of fossil insect wingspans across many deposits support this general picture. For the first part of insect history, with flight from the late Carboniferous through much of the Permian and into the early Mesozoic, the maximum size of flying insects appears to correlate with reconstructed atmospheric oxygen levels. When oxygen is high, the largest insects are larger. When it falls, the largest insects become smaller. However, in the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, roughly between 150 and 130 million years before the present, this correlation weakens. Atmospheric oxygen rises again toward values near or above modern levels, yet insect maximum sizes do not return to their earlier extremes. Instead, the upper size limits remain modest compared with the Carboniferous giants. This interval overlaps with the diversification of birds. Early forms like Archaeopteryx are followed by a variety of small to medium-sized birds that adapt to different feeding strategies, including insectivory. Some catch insects on the wing, others glean them from foliage or the ground. With time, their flight capabilities improve, and their taxonomic and ecological diversity increases. The presence of numerous aerial vertebrate insectivores changes the selective landscape for flying insects. Oxygen becomes only one part of the story. Even though higher oxygen would in principle allow insect tracheal systems to support larger bodies, the risk of predation shifts the balance in favour of forms that trade size for agility, cryptic behaviour, or specialised activity times. In addition to birds, pterosaurs also exert pressures on insect faunas, especially in coastal lacustrine and open environments where they patrol for prey. While many pterosaurs focus on fish or other vertebrates, smaller species and juveniles may take insects and other invertebrates. The combined effect of multiple groups of vertebrate flyers is to populate the air with predators capable of high-speed long-range pursuit and complex three-dimensional maneuvers. On the ground and in vegetation, other vertebrate insectivores, including small dinosaurs, early mammals and lizards, add to overall predation pressure. Later in the history of insects, another group of vertebrate flies appears that further reshapes nocturnal airspace. In the late Cretaceous and early Paleogene, roughly between 90 and 60 million years ago, bats evolve powered flight. Their wings are formed from membranes stretched between elongated fingers, and their skeletons and muscles adapt to this new mode of movement. Many early bats feed primarily on insect hunting at night. Over time, echolocation, the use of high-frequency sounds and their echoes to detect objects, evolves in several bat lineages. This allows them to locate and pursue flying insects in darkness, a time when birds are largely inactive. In sectors of the sky that had once been relatively safe for nocturnal insect flight, a new class of predators becomes active. Insects respond with their own adaptations, including ears tuned to bat calls in some groups, erratic flight patterns, and shifts in activity or habitat. However, the presence of both diurnal aerial predators such as birds and nocturnal ones such as bats means that across the full daily cycle, predation risk in the air remains high. Again, smaller size and agile flight can reduce capture probability. Larger insects, even if physiologically feasible under stable oxygen conditions, face increased danger. Over hundreds of millions of years, these interactions are reflected in the fossil record. After the mid-Mesozoic, there are no insects that reach the wingspan of the largest late Paleozoic forms. The largest modern flying insects, such as some tropical dragonflies and butterflies, have wingspans measured in several centimetres to a little more than 10 centimetres, impressive, but far below Carboniferous and early Permian giants. Their sizes appear to reflect a balance between the benefits of being large, such as improved thermal inertia, visual signalling, or access to particular resources, and the risks of predation and the constraints of mechanical and respiratory systems. On land and in water, similar processes occur. Large terrestrial arthropods continue to exist, but vertebrate predators, including reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds, occupy many of the top predator niches. Large arthropods that remain, such as some crab spiders and centipedes, are limited in size relative to the late Paleozoic giants, and often occupy specialized habitats where predation pressures and mechanical constraints are manageable. The rise of aerial vertebrate predators thus adds an additional inner layer to the factors that constrain insect size. After oxygen levels and habitat structures have set the broad outer conditions, and after plant communities and microbial decomposers have reshaped the landscapes and atmospheres of Earth, the evolution of birds and bats modifies the immediate survival prospects of individual insects in flight. Their presence does not cause the original decline of Paleozoic giants, which had already been shaped by earlier environmental changes, but they appear to play a key role in preventing the re-emergence of very large flying insects in later eras, even when oxygen and climate would otherwise permit larger sizes. Over the long span from the late Paleozoic to the present, insects and other arthropods continue to evolve within a world that changes its outlines many times. Continents break apart and drift, oceans open and close, mountain ranges rise and erode, and climates alternate between warmer and cooler phases. Through all these shifts, arthropods remain among the most diverse and abundant groups of animals on land and in fresh water. However, the pattern of their body sizes alters. The extreme gigantism seen in the Carboniferous and early Permian does not return. Instead, most insects occupy size ranges that, while varied, remain far below the maximum dimensions once attained by giant dragonfly relatives and huge millipedes. Several broad factors help explain this long-term pattern. One is the stabilization of atmospheric oxygen, near levels not far from those of the modern atmosphere, during much of the last hundreds of millions of years. After the high oxygen conditions of the late Carboniferous and early Permian reconstructions suggest that oxygen generally falls and then fluctuates around intermediate values, often close to about 20 to 25% by volume. Within this band, diffusion-based tracheal systems can support a wide range of insect sizes, but the respiratory advantage that once allowed very large bodies becomes less pronounced. Physiological experiments on living insects and theoretical models both indicate that under such oxygen levels, practical upper limits on body size for active flyers lie in the range seen in large modern dragonflies, moths and grasshoppers, rather than in the range occupied by late Paleozoic giants. At the same time, global ecosystems become more structurally and taxonomically complex. Plants diversify into many lineages, including flowering plants in the Cretaceous, and form forests, grasslands and shrublands suited to different climates. Insects radiate alongside them, evolving new mouthparts and life histories to exploit nectar pollen, leaves, seeds, wood and other resources. Complete metamorphosis, in which larvae and adults occupy distinct niches, becomes common in several major insect groups, including beetles, flies, butterflies, moths, and many wasps and their relatives. This life history strategy allows larvae to specialize in feeding and growth, while adults specialize in dispersal and reproduction. It also facilitates the evolution of very small body sizes, because larvae can inhabit tiny microhabitats within soil plant tissues or decaying material, while adults can remain small enough to move efficiently through cluttered environments and avoid predators. In these emerging ecosystems, size is only one of many axes along which insects diversify. For many lineages, success lies not in being large, but in being able to use narrow, ephemeral resources to reproduce quickly or to escape detection. Miniaturization opens niches that are inaccessible to larger animals. It allows insects to live between the hairs of a leaf inside seeds under bark scales, or in thin films of water. Over evolutionary time, many insect groups evolved toward body sizes measured in millimeters rather than in centimeters. Their populations can reach very high densities, and their collective ecological influence becomes enormous, even though individual bodies are small. Predation pressure remains another key factor. Birds and bats, along with many other vertebrate insectivores, occupy aerial and terrestrial habitats across the globe. They use keen senses and agile movement to capture insects in flight, on vegetation, and on the ground. Spiders and other arthropod predators add further layers of risk. In this context, large, slow-moving or slow-turning insects tend to face higher mortality. Selection favours body plans and behaviours that reduce encounter rates or improve escape performance. Small size aids both aims. Small insects can hide in fine structural refuges such as narrow cracks, dense foliage, or within plant tissues. When they fly, their low mass and short wings allow rapid acceleration and sudden changes of direction. Even when large body size might bring benefits such as greater fecundity or improved resistance to short-term environmental fluctuations, these advantages must be weighed against increased vulnerability to predators. The resulting trade-offs often favour intermediate or small sizes. Mechanical and developmental constraints also continue to act. The exoskeleton of insects and other arthropods must still balance strength and flexibility. It must permit molting, protect against desiccation and injury, and provide attachment points for muscles. As in the late Paleozoic, scaling relationships between area and volume mean that very large bodies require disproportionately thick and heavy exoskeletons if they are to remain mechanically safe, particularly on land. Under oxygen levels similar to those of the present tracheal systems can support moderate sizes, but further enlargement would demand extensive modifications in spiracle size, tracheal diameter, and body shape. These modifications may conflict with other functional requirements such as maintaining an effective barrier against water loss or retaining structural integrity during molting. In lineages where selection does not strongly favour increased size drift, and other processes allow body size to remain moderate or to decrease. Over deep time, bursts of morphological innovation in insects commonly involve changes in wings, mouth parts and life cycles rather than simple enlargement. As flowering plants spread during the Cretaceous and early Paleogene, they provide new resources that reward agility, precision, and sensory integration more than bulk. Pollinating insects, for example, benefit from the ability to hover to land on delicate flower structures without damaging them, and to navigate complex scent and colour landscapes. These demands draw evolutionary trajectories toward refined flight control, elaborated sensory organs, and often towards body sizes that match the dimensions of their floral partners. Alongside these general trends, variation persists, and some insects in later eras do reach relatively large sizes. Certain stick insects and leaf insects attain lengths of several tens of centimetres. Large beetles, such as some scarabs and longhorns, have massive bodies and strong exoskeletons. Giant wheaters and similar orthopterans grow to heavy weights for insects, and some moths and butterflies have wingspans approaching 30 centimetres. These cases show that within the modern atmospheric and ecological framework, substantial sizes remain possible. Yet even these large modern insects are small compared with Arthropleura or the largest Meganosopterans. Their presence highlights that the upper limit has shifted downward, but has not collapsed to a single narrow band. Within that new upper limit, the distribution of sizes is heavily skewed toward the small end, reflecting the combined influence of physiology, predation, habitat, structure, and resource patterns. In aquatic environments, arthropod sizes also adjust to changing conditions. Marine crustaceans such as crabs and lobsters, and freshwater forms such as crayfish, can grow large compared with most insects aided by buoyancy and different respiratory arrangements. However, they too remain below the lengths of the largest eurypterids. The decline of eurypterids and other giant aquatic arthropods is associated not only with atmospheric and ecological factors, but also with competition and predation from vertebrate fishes and marine reptiles, which assume many of the roles once filled by large arthropods. Over time, vertebrates increasingly dominate the large-bodied niches in many ecosystems, both on land and in water. Arthropods, while still extremely diverse and abundant, occupy a spectrum of sizes that emphasizes small and medium forms. The modern pattern can therefore be viewed as the outcome of several nested constraints. The outermost layer is the environmental context, oxygen levels, climate regimes, and the physical structure of habitats. Within this, the medium layer is ecological, the presence of predators and competitors, the availability and distribution of plant and microbial resources, and the web of interactions that link trophic levels. At the innermost layer lie the intrinsic limits of arthropod design, the properties of chitinous exoskeletons, the workings of tracheal or gill-based respiration, the mechanics of molting and limb movement, and the developmental pathways that generate body plans. Together, these layers bias evolution towards certain combinations of traits and away from others. Giant insects flourish in the late Paleozoic, when high-oxygen extensive humid forests, relatively simple vertebrate faunas on land, and the then existing arthropod designs align to make extreme sizes viable. Later, as the outer and middle layers change, the same intrinsic designs lead to different optima. Through the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, most lineages find their evolutionary stability at sizes that fit comfortably within the capacities of diffusion-based respiration and exoskeletal mechanics under near-modern atmospheric conditions and within ecosystems crowded with vertebrate and arthropod predators. The result is the familiar world in which insects are everywhere, performing countless ecological roles, but rarely large enough to dominate the landscape by sheer physical presence in the way their distant giant relatives once did. Across the intervals from the late Carboniferous into the Permian and beyond, the history of giant insects and other large arthropods unfolds as a sequence of linked environmental and biological changes. No single force brings their age to an abrupt stop. Instead, several processes acting at different scales and times progressively narrow the range of conditions under which extreme body sizes can persist. The first broad influence lies in the physical structure of late Paleozoic Earth. During the peak of the coal forests, low-lying equatorial basins with warm, humid climates and stable water supplies provide extensive habitats that favour large arthropods. Thick, wet litter and peat supply abundant plant material for herbivores and detritivores. Shallow lakes, ponds and slow channels embedded within the forest support aquatic larvae and connect terrestrial and aquatic food webs. Under these conditions, the combination of high atmospheric oxygen and suitable habitats allows some arthropod lineages to grow to sizes far beyond most modern counterparts. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse marks a turning point in this outer layer. As climates adjust to glacial cycles and the assembly of a large supercontinent, and as sea levels shift, many of the wide, permanently saturated lowlands contract or fragment. Swamps remain in some basins, but they no longer form a continuous equatorial belt. Between them spread more seasonal woodlands, scrub and open ground. Humidity becomes less dependable in many regions, and fire soil erosion and variable water tables alter the character of the land surface. For large arthropods that rely on extensive stable swamp forests, the resulting habitat mosaic reduces the area in which their ecological strategies can operate. Populations become more patchy, movement between favourable basins becomes more difficult, and local extinctions are less easily reversed. At the same time, developments in the microbial world change the balance of carbon and oxygen on a global scale. During much of the earlier Carboniferous wood-rich plant remains accumulate faster than they decompose, allowing large amounts of organic carbon to be buried and preserving high atmospheric oxygen. With the evolution and spread of fungi and bacteria that can efficiently break down lignin and other complex plant polymers, this balance shifts. Fallen wood and other tissues are decomposed more completely, returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and consuming oxygen. Combined with the reduced extent of peat-forming environments, this leads over millions of years to a gradual decline in oxygen and a rise in carbon dioxide. The exact timing and magnitude of these changes differ among reconstructions, but the overall trend from high Carboniferous oxygen toward more moderate levels in the Permian is well supported. For insects and other arthropods that depend on diffusion-based respiratory systems, this atmospheric adjustment tightens physiological constraints. Under high oxygen, tracheal systems and book lungs can supply large tissue volumes with enough gas to support movement and in flying insects' active flight. As oxygen falls, the same anatomical arrangements deliver less. Large body size becomes more difficult to sustain without modifications that increase spiracle area tracheal cross-section or ventilation effort. For many lineages, these modifications appear limited or insufficient. Fossil evidence shows that the maximum size of flying insects' tracks estimated oxygen levels reasonably closely through the late Carboniferous, and much of the Permian as oxygen rises. The largest flying insects become larger. As it declines, their maximum size decreases. Giant terrestrial arthropods such as Arthropleura and large scorpions may tolerate declining oxygen slightly better than large flying insects, because their locomotion demands less power per unit time, but they are not exempt. Over time, records indicate that these forms disappear as well, leaving smaller descendants or no direct successors. Parallel to these atmospheric and microbial changes, the composition of land plant communities shifts. Early swamp floras dominated by leucopsid trees, horsetail relatives and seed ferns give way, especially in drier and more seasonal regions, to gymnosperm-rich vegetation with conifer-like trees and other drought-adapted seed plants. These plants differ from their predecessors in morphology, tissue structure, and chemical defenses. Their leaves are often tougher and more heavily defended. Their seeds and cones require different feeding adaptations, and their wood and litter interact differently with decomposers. Herbivorous and sap-feeding insects that are tightly linked to older plant groups, including many Paleodictyopterans, with long, piercing mouthparts suited to swamp plants, face declining availability of their preferred hosts. Some adapt to new floras or shift diets, others show reductions in diversity and range and eventually disappear. Changes in plant chemistry and nutrient content under higher carbon dioxide regimes may further alter the energetic balance for large herbivores and detritivores, favouring smaller, more specialised feeders that can meet their needs from scattered defended resources. Within these evolving landscapes, vertebrates increasingly occupy roles that intersect with those of large arthropods. Amphibians and early reptiles and later synapsids diversify into forms that feed on insects, other invertebrates and plants. Over time, especially in the Permian, some vertebrate herbivores and predators grow to large sizes and take up ecological spaces comparable to those once occupied by giant arthropods. This does not immediately remove the remaining giants, but it alters the structure of food webs and the competition for resources. Large arthropods now share their environments with vertebrate predators that can pursue them on land and in water, and with vertebrate herbivores that can process plant material in different ways. As the Permian progresses, episodes of climatic stress and near its end, severe global crises further reshape faunas. Many lineages, both vertebrate and invertebrate, decline or vanish during these events. By the time ecosystems recover in the Triassic, the characteristic giant insects and millipedes of the Carboniferous and early Permian are no longer present. In later chapters of insect history, atmospheric oxygen returns to values that in principle could support larger flying bodies. Yet the giants do not reappear. Analyses that combine fossil insect wingspans with independent oxygen estimates indicate that from the late Jurassic into the early Cretaceous, around 150 to 130 million years before the present, the previous tight link between oxygen and maximum insect size weakens. During this interval, birds diversify and refine powered flight, and pterosaurs continue to occupy aerial niches. These vertebrate flyers act as effective predators of insects in the air. Their abilities to detect prey at a distance, to maneuver rapidly in 3 dimensions, and to sustain extended chases create strong selection against large, slow-turning insect forms. Later bats extend similar pressures into the nocturnal airspace. Under these conditions, even if oxygen would allow large tracheal systems to function, predation risks steer the evolution of flying insects towards sizes and behaviours that reduce capture probability. Large, broad-winged gliders and slow-flapping forms become rare or absent. Smaller, more agile flyers, and those that use cluttered habitats or specific times of activity remain common. Taken together, these factors show a layered pattern. At the outermost scale, tectonic and climatic processes reshape continents, and climates fragmenting coal forests and altering water availability. At a global chemical scale, evolving decomposers and shifting, carbon burial adjust atmospheric oxygen and carbon dioxide, tightening physiological limits on large diffusion-based respiratory systems. At an ecosystem scale, plant community changes alter food quality, structure and distribution, challenging large herbivorous and sap-feeding insects. Within food webs, the rise and diversification of vertebrates, including aerial insectivores, changes predation regimes. Each layer on its own would influence arthropod sizes. Acting together over tens of millions of years, they progressively remove or weaken the combinations of conditions that once favoured giant insects and other large arthropods. Uncertainties remain about details. The exact oxygen trajectory through some intervals is still refined as new proxies and models are developed. The precise roles and timings of different fungal groups, plant lineages, and animal clades are complex and vary between regions. For some arthropod groups, fossil records are sparse, making it difficult to trace body size changes continuously. However, the broad outline remains robust. The giants of the late Paleozoic arise in a world with extensive humid lowlands, high oxygen, and plant and microbial communities that together remove some of the usual constraints on body size. As habitats contract oxygen, false floras and faunas reorganize and vertebrate predators claim more of the available niches. The window that allowed extreme arthropod gigantism gradually closes. Large arthropods do not vanish entirely, but their maximum sizes decrease, and their ecological prominence shifts. Modern insects and their relatives inherit this altered inner landscape of constraints and opportunities, living within ranges of size and form that differ from those of their distant giant predecessors. Thank you for spending this time with Documentary for Sleep. May these quiet journeys through deep time bring rest, curiosity, and a gentle sense of calm to the end of your day. There are many more worlds to visit, many more stories written in stone ice and ancient skies. We look forward to meeting again in the next episodes, where new landscapes, creatures, and ages of Earth will unfold slowly and softly as you drift towards sleep. Until then, rest well and see you next time.